Imagine the wind whispering through the sacred olive groves as a lone traveler, weary and determined, makes the long ascent toward the temple of Apollo at Delphi. The air is thick with the scent of burning laurel leaves and the low hum of anticipation. This pilgrim has journeyed for weeks, maybe months, carrying with them a question that could alter the fate of a kingdom, a family, or a life. Ahead lies the Pythia, the mysterious priestess said to bridge the worlds of mortals and gods, breathing the intoxicating vapors rising from a crack in the earth and delivering prophecies that shaped the ancient world. For centuries, these oracles held unimaginable power, guiding kings in war, settlers in founding cities, and ordinary people in matters of the heart. But what if everything you think you know about these prophetic voices is only a fraction of the truth? Behind the legendary tales of riddles and fate lie deeper, stranger, and far more human stories, accounts of political manipulation, sacred fraud, startling coincidences, and moments where the line between divine inspiration and sheer madness blurred beyond recognition. These are the stories that history often overlooks, the whispers buried under layers of myth and idealization. Today, we're not just revisiting the famous prophecies, we're pulling back the curtain on the hidden world of the oracles to uncover 30 astonishing narratives that challenge conventional wisdom and invite you to see these figures in a completely new light. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's an exploration of belief, power, and the timeless human desire to glimpse what lies ahead. From the inner workings of the oracle sites to the surprising individuals who sought their guidance, we'll delve into tales of deception, devotion, and divine ambiguity that resonate even today. So settle in and open your mind. What you're about to discover may forever change how you see these ancient seers, and perhaps even how you confront the unknown in your own life. Our journey into the untold begins not at the sun-drenched rocks of Delphi, but in the shadow of a far older and more enigmatic sanctuary, nestled in the remote highlands of Epirus. This is Dodona, the oldest Hellenic oracle, a place where the divine voice was not a woman's, but the very whisper of the earth itself through the sacred leaves of a mighty oak. While Delphi would later claim fame, Dodona's power was primal, rooted in the deep, ancient belief that the gods spoke through the natural world. Here, priests known as the Seloi, who were said to sleep on the bare earth and never wash their feet, would lie beneath the sprawling branches of the holy oak tree, listening intently. Their entire practice of divination was an act of profound interpretation. They didn't just hear wind, they decoded the language of the gods in the rustle of every leaf, the coo of a dove nesting in its branches, and the resonant, lingering clang of bronze cauldrons hung from its boughs, each sound weaving a complex, heavenly message. This unique method of divination will be put to the ultimate test during a pivotal moment in Spartan history. Around the year 480 BC, with the massive Persian invasion force of Xerxes drawing nearer every day, the Spartan king, Cleomenes I, found himself paralyzed by indecision. The very survival of his city-state hung in the balance. He needed a clear sign from the gods, and so he sent envoys on the long and perilous journey to consult the whispering oak of Dodona. The response they brought back was everything an oracle should be, perfectly clear and utterly baffling. The message stated that Sparta would only retain its sovereignty if its king lost his life. On the surface, it seemed like a grim but straightforward prediction of a royal death in battle. But oracles, especially from a place as nuanced as Dodona, were rarely so simple. King Cleomenes, a man known for his ambition and perhaps his pride, interpreted the prophecy in the most literal way possible. He believed it meant he was fated to die a glorious death on the battlefield, securing victory for Sparta. But the oak's whisper held a darker, more subtle truth. The word used for sovereignty could also be interpreted as freedom, and the loss of the king could mean something far less heroic than a soldier's end. What transpired next was a chilling fulfillment that no one could have foreseen. Rather than falling to a Persian spear, Cleomenes descended into a fit of such violent, self-destructive madness that his own bodyguards, fearing for their safety, were forced to restrain him. Locked in stocks, consumed by a frenzy he could not control, the king took his own life with a small knife. The oracle was fulfilled. The king had lost his life, and in doing so, Sparta retained its freedom, but the cost was a terrifying lesson in the literal-minded interpretation of divine ambiguity. For centuries, the oracle at Dodona was thought to be the stuff of pure legend, a poetic metaphor lost to time. That is, until archaeologists began to peel back the layers of soil in the 19th and 20th centuries. Their discoveries were nothing short of stunning. They unearthed not only the foundations of the sacred precinct, but also a treasure trove of material evidence, countless lead tablets. These were the physical questions asked by everyday people, etched nervously onto thin strips of metal. Their inquiries are heartbreakingly human, pulling the oracle down from the realm of epic kings and into the lives of ordinary souls. A farmer asks if he should lease his field near the coast. A woman named Lysanias inquires if she is pregnant. A slave wonders if his master will free him. These artifacts prove that Dodona was not just a strategic tool for generals and rulers. It was a deeply personal place of hope, fear, and desperate need, where the rustle of an oak's leaves held the power to change a life. Yet the story of the Pythia is not complete without understanding the immense psychological and spiritual weight she carried. Before any consultation, she underwent days of intense purification. She would bathe in the sacred Castalian spring, a ritual act of washing away not just physical impurity but worldly concerns. She would fast, perhaps consuming only laurel leaves and sacred barley, distancing her body and mind from the mundane to become a clearer vessel for the god. She would then wait in the inner sanctum, the Aditon, a small, enclosed chamber below the temple floor, seated upon a tall, three-legged tripod cauldron directly over the fissure. As the gases rose, the transition was said to be dramatic. The serene, respected woman from the local village would begin to shudder, her body convulsing, her head thrashing. Her breathing would become labored, her voice would drop to a guttural rasp, and she would begin to speak in fragmented, ecstatic phrases, the raw, unfiltered words of Apollo himself. This leaves us with a profound and haunting question. Was her prophecy the result of a simple geological narcotic, a divine possession, or something else entirely, a brilliant subconscious synthesis of both? The priests in the chamber were not just translators, they were skilled interpreters, weaving her frantic utterances into the elegant, often ambiguous hexameter verses that were delivered to the anxious petitioner waiting outside. This entire process, the gas, the ritual, the interpretation, transformed a local woman into the most powerful political and spiritual figure in the ancient world. Her words, born from the very rock of the earth and the depths of the human psyche, would launch fleets, halt armies, and seal the fates of kings, proving that the source of true power is often the most complex mystery of all. Even as the Pythia of Delphi reached the zenith of her influence, another oracle, grand in scale and ambition, was rising in the east. The oracle of Apollo at Didyma, on the coast of what is now Turkey, was not housed in a modest chamber but in a colossal temple, one of the largest and most magnificent in the entire ancient world. Its priests were not interpreters of whispers but custodians of a sprawling sacred complex, and its prophetic spring was said to be guarded by a family of hereditary prophets known as the Branchidae. It was here, amidst its unfinished, sprawling columns, that a young Alexander the Great, fresh from his early victories, arrived in the year 334 BC, seeking not just a prediction, but a divine endorsement of his world-altering ambitions. He expected a prophecy of glory, of conquest, of his rightful place as a god-king. What he received was a chilling paradox that would echo through the centuries. The priestess, perhaps sensing the immense and disruptive force standing before her, delivered a pronouncement that was both an acknowledgement and a dire warning. She declared that the god granted Alexander an invincible power that would bring him victory after victory. But this promise of glory was immediately followed by a second, darker utterance. She prophesied that this very temple, the source of her power and the house of the god, would one day be destroyed, and that its destroyer would be none other than Alexander himself. The statement must have seemed ludicrous, a contradiction so profound it bordered on blasphemy. Why would the conqueror who revered Greek gods, who traced his lineage to Zeus and sought the blessing of Apollo, ever destroy one of his most sacred sites? Alexander, likely bewildered but driven by his destiny, accepted the first part of the prophecy and moved on, leaving the ominous second half to hang in the air, an unresolved chord in the symphony of his campaigns. For generations, the prophecy was remembered as a strange, unfulfilled curiosity. The temple of Apollo at Didyma continued to function, its wealth and influence growing even as Alexander's empire fractured after his death. The Branchidae family continued their sacred duties. The prophecy seemed to have failed. That is, until over 450 years later, when the world had been utterly transformed by the rise of the Roman Empire and the rapid spread of Christianity. In the late 4th century AD, the Christian Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of decrees ordering the closure of all pagan temples and the banning of their rituals. This was not merely a law, it was a declaration of holy war on the old gods, and it empowered zealous mobs to enact their faith through violent destruction. It is here that the ancient prophecy revealed its horrifying, literal truth. The man who led the Christian mob to the gates of the great temple at Didyma, the man who gave the order to tear down the sacred statues, to smash the altars, to silence the oracle forever, was the local provincial governor. His name was Alexander. He was a devout Christian, a servant of a new god and a new emperor, and in his mind he was purging the world of idolatry and superstition. He was almost certainly unaware of the ancient prophecy given to his famous namesake centuries before. Yet in that moment he became the unwitting instrument of its fulfillment. Alexander did destroy the oracle just as the priestess had foretold. The sacred spring was sealed, the temple was desecrated and converted into a church, and the voice of Apollo at Didyma was silenced for good. This story transcends a simple, ironic coincidence. It speaks to the terrifying nature of self-aware prophecy, of an institution foreseeing its own doom and being powerless to stop it. The oracle didn't just predict an event, it identified its specific agent, a name that became a vessel for fate across hundreds of years. It suggests that the gods or the forces of history operate on a timeline far beyond human comprehension, where a name can be a title passed down through destiny, waiting for the right moment to act. The destruction of Didyma wasn't a random act of violence. It was the closing of a loop, the final, tragic verse of a poem the oracle itself had begun. But the sanctuary at Delphi was far more than a mouthpiece for the gods. It was also a complex human institution, a microcosm of the ancient world with its own surprising rules and hierarchies. While the priests who interpreted the Pythia's ravings were often men of high birth and influence, the woman at the very heart of the mystery, the vessel for Apollo's voice, could come from anywhere. The rules for selecting a Pythia were astonishingly simple and democratic for their time. She was to be a local woman from the nearby village of Delphi of good character who would dedicate her life to the god. And in one extraordinary case, that life began not in freedom but in chains. This is the story of a Thracian slave woman whose name is lost to history, a person who was once considered property, a living tool to be bought and sold. How she arrived in Delphi is unclear, perhaps captured in a raid, sold by pirates, or born into servitude. Her days would have been filled with hard labor, her existence defined by the will of her master. Yet within the sacred confines of the temple, a different set of values prevailed. The priests of Apollo were searching for a new Pythia, and for reasons we can only speculate about, perhaps an observed piety, a certain presence of mind, or a simple, undeniable inner strength, they looked past her social status and saw a soul fit for the god. In a move that would have been unthinkable in almost any other context in the ancient world, they purchased her freedom and elevated her to the most prestigious religious office in Greece. This was not merely a symbolic gesture. As a Pythia, she was no longer a slave or even an ordinary citizen. She became a sacred figure, afforded immense respect, provided for by the temple and protected by religious law. Her voice, when possessed by the god, held authority over kings and generals. The very fact that the Delphic priesthood would select a former slave speaks volumes about their pragmatic and perhaps truly spiritual priorities. What mattered was not lineage or wealth, but a quality of spirit that could withstand the terrifying ordeal of divine possession and channel the voice of a god with clarity and power. Her background may have even been an asset. Having known the ultimate powerlessness of slavery, she perhaps understood the nuances of human struggle and ambition in a way a noblewoman never could, bringing a unique perspective to the cryptic counsel she delivered. We can only imagine how her experiences shaped the prophecies that flowed through her. When a wealthy merchant asked about a business venture, did she, on some level, remember the feeling of being traded as cargo? When a general sought advice on strategy, did the memory of having no control over her own destiny lend a particular weight to her words about fate and fortune? Her prophecies would have been filtered and versified by the priests, but the raw material, the emotional and spiritual core, came from her. She embodied a profound paradox. The most marginalized member of society became the central channel for the divine, a living testament to the idea that the gods do not see as mortals see. Her incredible journey from bondage to the tripod of Apollo reveals a startling sliver of social mobility in a rigidly hierarchical world, proving that within the smoke and chaos of the oracle chamber, the only thing that truly mattered was the ability to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. Far from the cerebral ambiguity of Delphi, in the region of Boeotia, lay an oracle that offered not riddles but raw, visceral terror. This was the oracle of Trophonius, an experience so profoundly harrowing that the Greek language gained a new phrase. To consult Trophonius was to permanently lose your ability to smile, to be forever marked by a glimpse into the abyss. Unlike the sunlit temples of Apollo, this was a chthonic, subterranean sanctuary dedicated to a hero who had become a daemon, a powerful spirit of the earth. Seekers didn't come here for political advice or romantic guidance. They came for one of the most practical and vital needs of the ancient world, a reliable long-range weather forecast. For farmers planting their next season's crops and sailors preparing to cross the treacherous Aegean Sea, knowing the patterns of storms, winds, and droughts was a matter of survival and economic prosperity. The oracle at Lebadia provided this service with an unparalleled reputation for accuracy, but the price of this knowledge was a descent into a personal nightmare. The preparation was an ordeal in itself. An initiate would spend several days in a special lodge, performing rituals to appease the spirits and sacrificing to a whole pantheon of underworld deities. They would bathe in the icy waters of the nearby Hersina River and be anointed with special oils, all under the careful supervision of priests who acted less as spiritual guides and more as brutal therapists, conditioning the seeker for the trauma to come. The climax of the ritual was the descent. The seeker would be led to a narrow opening in the earth, little more than a hole, with a tiny ladder leading down into utter blackness. Clutching a honey cake in each hand as an offering to the spirits below, they would lie on their back and push themselves feet first into the chasm, sliding down into a cramped, pitch-black tunnel. At the bottom, they would be violently pulled through a narrow opening, described as the experience of being sucked down by a raging river. In this absolute darkness, cut off from all sensory input, the seeker would then receive their vision. Some heard a cacophony of disembodied whispers and screams. Others saw fleeting, horrifying images, Many simply felt an overwhelming primal dread. The experience was uniquely tailored to shatter the individual's psyche, breaking down their rational mind to allow a primal, intuitive knowledge to flood in. When they were finally pulled back out, pale, trembling, and often in a state of catatonic shock, they were seated upon the throne of memory. Here, the priests would gently debrief them, patiently helping them piece together the fragmented sights and sounds into a coherent forecast. A vision of swirling darkness might predict a month of storms. A feeling of parched heat could foretell a coming drought. The genius of the oracle of Trophonius lay in this psychological manipulation. By subjecting the seeker to extreme sensory deprivation and terror, the priests were triggering a heightened state of awareness. In this state, the individual likely became hyper-attuned to subtle cues their conscious mind had already registered but ignored. The behavior of animals, the slight changes in air pressure, the color of the sunset, subconsciously weaving these minute observations into a predictive vision that felt divinely inspired. The priests, skilled interpreters of human trauma, then translated this raw, emotional vision into the practical, life-saving weather report the seeker had come for. It was a brutal but incredibly effective merger of extreme psychology and earthly necessity, proving that in the ancient world, the most valuable truths were often those you had to suffer to receive. While the oracle of Trophonius used terror to unlock practical knowledge, another form of ancient prophecy offered something far more personal and desperately sought: the promise of healing. Scattered across the Greek world, from the slopes of Athens to the island of Kos, were the Asclepia, sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. These were not temples of cryptic pronouncements, but hospitals of the soul and body, where the oracle did not speak through a priestess, but directly to the afflicted in the vulnerable state of sleep. The entire process was a meticulously designed ritual of hope and suggestion, a sophisticated system of dream interpretation that blurred the lines between divine miracle and profound psychological understanding. A seeker coming to an Asclepian, perhaps suffering from a years-old wound that would not close or a mysterious internal pain, would first undergo a period of purification. They would bathe, make offerings, and present themselves at the altar, often sacrificing a rooster, an animal sacred to the healing god. Then the central ritual began, the enkoimesis, or the sacred incubation. The patient would be led into a long hall-like gallery called the abaton, a place forbidden to the general public. Here, in the hushed darkness, surrounded by other hopeful sufferers, they would lie on a pallet of animal skins and wait for sleep to come. The air would have been thick with the scent of burning herbs and the low murmur of prayers, every sense primed for a divine encounter. It was believed that in this sanctified space, the god Asclepius himself or his sacred serpents would visit the dreamer, either performing a miraculous healing surgery in the dream or providing a clear prescription for a cure upon waking. The case studies that survive, inscribed on steels at these sanctuaries as testimonials to the god's power, are astonishing in their detail. A man named Ambrosia from Athens, who was blind in one eye, came to the sanctuary desperate. In her dream, the god appeared to open her afflicted eye with a scalpel and pour a powerful medicine into it. When she awoke, she could see. A man with a spearhead lodged in his jaw for years dreamt that the god extracted the piece of metal and handed it to him in his palm. Upon waking, he held the physical spearhead and his wound was healed. Another account tells of a woman who had been pregnant for 5 years. In her dream, the god cut open her womb, removed the child, dressed him, and placed him in her arms. When she woke up, she was no longer pregnant, and a small stone statue of a child was resting beside her. What makes these accounts so fascinating is not just the reported miracles, but the undeniable medical and psychological acumen of the priests who managed the sanctuaries. These were not mere mystics, they were early practitioners of what we would now recognize as psychosomatic medicine. Before a patient even entered the abaton, they were interviewed by the priest physicians. They would discuss their ailments, their lifestyles, and their fears. This information gave the priests incredible insight. When the patient emerged in the morning to recount their often chaotic and symbolic dream, the priest would interpret it, effectively diagnosing the illness and prescribing a treatment based on the dream's imagery. A dream of a god applying a salve might translate to the priest prescribing a specific herbal poultice. A vision of a serpent, a symbol of renewal, and a sacred animal of Asclepius coiling around a limb might indicate the need for binding and rest. The true genius of the Asclepian system was its masterful, if unconscious, harnessing of the placebo effect and the power of suggestion. The entire environment was engineered to inspire absolute belief and expectation of a cure. The lengthy pre-sleep rituals, the sacred space, the presence of other healed patients, and the overwhelming authority of the priestly interpreters all worked in concert to put the patient's mind into a highly receptive, suggestible state. The dream state then became a theater where the body's own healing capabilities could be unlocked through powerful symbolism. The patient's belief that a divine surgeon had operated on them could trigger real physiological changes, reducing inflammation, improving circulation, or mitigating pain. The priests, in effect, were guiding the patients to subconsciously prescribe their own cures, using the language of dreams to access a depth of self-healing that conscious thought could not reach. This ancient practice reveals a profound understanding that the most powerful oracle of all might not be a voice from the gods, but the untapped potential of the human mind to mend its own vessel when given the right key. Yet for all the healing dreams and weather forecasts, the most powerful oracles were those that shaped the fate of empires, and few moments in history demonstrate this more starkly than the lead up to the final war of the Roman Republic. By 32 BC, the political alliance between Octavian, the shrewd adopted son of Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony, the legendary general, had shattered completely. The Mediterranean world was divided, and a colossal naval confrontation was inevitable. Both men understood that victory would require more than just military might. It would demand the unequivocal favor of the gods. This sent Octavian on a calculated pilgrimage to several major oracles, not merely to seek guidance, but to actively collect divine endorsements he could wield as psychological weapons. The most significant response came from the oracle of Apollo at Actium, the very region where the fleets would eventually clash. The prophecy delivered to Octavian was a masterpiece of Delphic ambiguity, a single, potent line. The Romans will never be blessed unless the two-headed one is gone from the earth. On its surface, this seemed to be a grave problem for Octavian. The most obvious interpretation pointed directly at him. A coin of the era minted by Octavian himself depicted his own profile with two faces, Janus-like, symbolizing his dual role as a civil magistrate and a military commander. To his soldiers and the public, this two-headed one could easily be seen as Octavian. His enemies would certainly seize upon this reading to claim the gods had turned against him. But Octavian, a master of propaganda, immediately reframed the prophecy to serve his own ends. He launched a brilliant campaign to reinterpret the two-headed one not as himself, but as Mark Antony and his lover, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. He portrayed them as a monstrous, two-headed beast, a hybrid abomination of Roman and Eastern decadence that threatened the very soul of the Republic. This wasn't just a clever twist, it was a full-scale information war. His agents spread this new interpretation far and wide, etching it into the public consciousness through speeches, pamphlets, and coins. The oracle's words were no longer a threat to his cause. They were a divine mandate to eradicate his enemies and restore Rome's purity. He had successfully weaponized ambiguity, turning a potential crisis of legitimacy into his greatest rallying cry. When the massive fleets finally met in the Battle of Actium, Octavian's propaganda proved as decisive as his tactics. His soldiers and sailors went into battle believing they were fighting on the side of the gods, that they were the instruments of a prophesied cleansing. Conversely, Antony's forces, who would have heard the widely circulated official interpretation, may have felt a lurking sense of divine disfavor. After his victory, Octavian, who would soon become the Emperor Augustus, wasted no time in cementing this narrative. He built a magnificent monument and a new city, Nicopolis, the City of Victory, on the site of his military camp, and he rededicated the very sanctuary of Apollo at Actium, loudly proclaiming his gratitude to the god who had foretold his triumph. He didn't just win a battle, he authored history, using an oracle's riddle as the foundational text for his new era of rule, demonstrating that the most potent prophecies are often those shaped by the hands of the victors. While Octavian was shaping the destiny of an empire through deliberate reinterpretation, another oracle operated on a principle that seemed its utter opposite: the pure, unfiltered, and unsettling voice of a child. On the coast of Ionia, near the bustling city of Colophon, stood the oracle of Apollo at Claros, a sanctuary that stood out even in a world full of strange rituals. Here there was no gas-emitting chasm, no sacred oak, and no trembling priestess. Instead, the divine voice was channeled through the most unexpected of vessels, a young boy, chosen for his innocence and believed to be a blank slate upon which the god could write his will. The ritual was both simple and deeply eerie. After a night of elaborate public sacrifices and hymns sung by a chorus, the prophetic session would begin in utter secrecy, conducted in a dark, subterranean crypt deep beneath the temple. The presiding priest would descend into this sacred space first. Then the chosen child, a boy from a local, respected family, would drink from a special basin filled with water from a mystical spring believed to be endowed with prophetic powers. What happened next was described by ancient sources with a sense of awe. The child did not enter a violent trance like the Pythia. Instead, he was said to be filled with a divine light, a sudden and profound wisdom that transformed him. In a clear, measured voice, he would then deliver a spontaneous and detailed prophecy, often in perfectly composed verse, answering the questions posed by the petitioners waiting anxiously above. This practice immediately raises profound ethical questions that resonate with a modern audience. These were not volunteers in any sense we would understand. They were children, likely selected by the priests or their own families, thrust into a role they could not possibly consent to. We are left to wonder about the psychological impact of such an experience. What did it feel like for a young boy to have his consciousness seemingly supplanted by a divine force? Did he remember the words he spoke? Was he celebrated afterwards, or was he frightened by the loss of control? The ancient sources, written from the perspective of admiring believers, are silent on these points, focusing only on the wonder of the miracle. But we can imagine the potential for trauma, for a profound confusion of identity in a developing mind tasked with bearing the weight of adult crises and cosmic truths. The theological reasoning behind using a child is fascinating. The priests of Claros believed that a pure, pre-pubescent youth was less corrupted by the world, his mind uncluttered by personal ambition, desire, or guile. He was therefore a cleaner, more receptive instrument for the god's voice than a worldly adult. His simple, innocent responses to the priest's questions were not seen as naive. They were interpreted as divine messages in their rawest form, untainted by human interpretation. This contrasts sharply with the Delphic model, where the Pythia's ravings required skilled priests to translate them into coherent poetry. At Claros, the prophecy was thought to come directly from the god to the child's lips, with the priests acting only as facilitators of the ritual, not interpreters of the message. One can only ponder the mechanics at play. Was the sacred water doctored with a mild psychoactive substance, something that would lower inhibitions and encourage a dreamlike state of receptivity? Or was the entire ritual a masterpiece of psychological conditioning? The child would have been steeped in the myths and language of the god from a very young age. The night-long ceremonies, the chanting, the descent into the dark, mysterious crypt, all of it would have built an overwhelming expectation of a divine encounter. In such a heightened state of suggestibility, a bright, well-coached child might have been able to tap into a deep well of religious poetry and cultural knowledge, improvising responses that felt inspired because they emerged from a subconscious place he himself did not fully understand. The prophecy, delivered in hexameter verse, may have been the product of a trained and gifted mind operating under immense peer pressure and spiritual fervor, a phenomenon not unlike child prodigies in other fields who perform feats that seem to defy their years. The legacy of the child oracles of Claros forces us to confront the complex and often dark intersection of faith, power, and innocence. It presents a starkly different model of revelation, one that traded the agonized ecstasy of the Pythia for the serene, unsettling wisdom of a child. It was a practice built on the beautiful, yet potentially exploitative, idea that truth resides in purity. But in searching for a voice untainted by the world, the ancient world may have inadvertently shown us how easily the vulnerable can be used as instruments for the needs of the powerful, all under the sacred and unassailable guise of divine will. Just as the psychological and spiritual power of the oracles could shape individual destinies, their influence also extended to matters of literal life and death on a massive scale. In the year 430 BC, a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions struck the city of Athens. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta was in its second year, and the strategic genius of Pericles had led to a controversial plan to abandon the Attic countryside and withdraw the entire population behind the massive walls connecting Athens to its port Piraeus. This move created a desperately overcrowded, makeshift city within a city, a perfect breeding ground for disaster, and that disaster arrived in the form of a terrifying and unknown disease, thought by many modern historians to have been typhus or a form of epidemic typhus. The plague that swept through the cramped confines of Athens was horrifying in its symptoms and its speed. Thucydides, who survived it himself, left a chillingly clinical account. It began with a sudden, intense fever and inflammation of the eyes. The throat and tongue would become bloody and emit a foul odor, followed by uncontrollable sneezing and hoarseness. Then came violent coughing and stomach cramps leading to every form of bodily evacuation imaginable. Most victims broke out in small, painful pustules and ulcers. Many went insane from the relentless suffering, tearing off their clothes to plunge into cisterns of water in a futile attempt to quench an unending thirst. The death toll was staggering, wiping out perhaps a quarter of the city's population, including its great leader, Pericles. In the face of this helplessness, with doctors dying alongside their patients and all human medicine proving useless, the desperate Athenians did the only thing they could. They sent a delegation to Delphi, begging Apollo the healer for a way to save their city. The Pythia's response was, as always, layered. She did not provide a medical cure, for such a thing was beyond mortal knowledge. Instead, she offered a divine prescription for purification. Apollo commanded the Athenians to set up altars and make offerings to a new, unfamiliar deity he would introduce to them. The god instructed them to seek out a man named Epimenides, a legendary seer and purifier from Crete, and follow his ancient rituals to cleanse the city of the miasma, the spiritual pollution that had brought the plague upon them. While the historical timeline is debated, the traditions surrounding Epimenides' methods provide a fascinating glimpse into the oracle's advice. His prescribed purification was remarkably practical. He reportedly released sheep across the hills around the city, instructing the people to erect altars and make sacrifices to the appropriate local deities at the exact spot where each sheep lay down to rest. This ritual not only honored the gods of the land, but also functionally identified areas upwind and away from the central, infected population centers for these large public gatherings, moving people out of the densest, most contaminated urban zones. More importantly, the purification rituals involved a massive city-wide cleanup. The countless unburied corpses, a source of profound religious terror and a massive biological hazard. were given proper funeral rites and interred in mass graves outside the city walls, a shocking break with tradition that was deemed necessary by divine order. The Athenians were also instructed to dig new, deep wells to access clean groundwater, abandoning the crowded and contaminated public cisterns. They were to strictly control the disposal of waste, particularly human waste, designating specific areas far from living quarters and water sources for its disposal. On the surface, these were acts of religious piety designed to appease angry gods, but on a practical, earthly level, they were a masterclass in rudimentary public health and sanitation. By moving gatherings outdoors, burying the dead, securing a clean water supply, and managing sewage, the Athenians were unknowingly breaking the cycle of disease transmission. The fleas that likely carried the illness had fewer animal hosts and concentrated areas of infection. The waterborne pathogens had fewer avenues to spread. The intense focus on ritual purity created a cleaner, more orderly environment that was inherently less hospitable to the plague. We cannot know for certain how much these measures directly reduced the mortality rate, but the historical record indicates the plague's ferocity eventually subsided. The oracle, in its cryptic way, had not offered a miracle, it had offered a system. It redirected the people's frantic energy from panic into a series of organized, purposeful actions that addressed the root causes of the outbreak. The divine command provided the unassailable authority needed to enact drastic, unpopular, but necessary measures like moving bodies and digging new wells that no human leader could have ordered without being overthrown. In this moment of existential crisis, the voice from Delphi proved to be not just spiritually insightful, but profoundly pragmatic. It saved Athens not by magic, but by mandating the first known large-scale public health intervention in history, demonstrating that sometimes the line between a sacred purification and a scientific sanitation is far thinner than it appears. One of the most poignant and enduring legends of the ancient world centers not on a place, but on a person, the Cumaean Sibyl. Her story is a powerful testament to how the value of prophecy is often only recognized in hindsight, a tragedy of missed opportunity that would haunt the Roman state for centuries. Unlike the institutional oracles tied to specific temples, the Sibyl was a wandering prophetess, a figure of immense personal power and profound loneliness. She was said to reside in a cavern near the Greek colony of Cumae in Italy, and her life was shrouded in a unique and heartbreaking divine bargain. According to the myth, the god Apollo, smitten with her, offered to grant her any wish. The Sibyl pointed to a pile of dust and asked for as many years of life as there were grains of sand. Apollo granted her wish, but she had committed a fatal error in her phrasing. She had asked for long life, but she had forgotten to ask for eternal youth. As the centuries rolled on, her body withered and shrank, trapped in an endless cycle of decay without the release of death. She was kept in a jar or a cage, her voice growing ever fainter, her form becoming so tiny that children would mockingly ask her, "Sibyl, what do you want?" To which she would whisper her devastating reply, "I want to die." This tragic existence framed her prophecies not as the ecstatic ravings of a temporary vessel, but as the hard-won, bitter wisdom of someone who had seen the rise and fall of ages. Her divine words were written on oak leaves, which she would arrange on the floor of her cave, but the Sibyl's genius was also her curse. If a supplicant entered and a gust of wind scattered the leaves, the prophecy was lost forever. The message itself was as fragile and transient as her own humanity. It was this figure who, according to tradition, approached the last king of Rome, the arrogant Tarquinius Superbus, with an offer that would define the spiritual destiny of his city. She came to him carrying 9 books which she claimed contained the complete and divinely inspired prophecies for the entire future of Rome. Every crisis, every war, every salvation. Her price for this unparalleled treasure was exorbitant. Tarquinius, viewing her as a mere beggar woman and her books as the ramblings of a mad crone, laughed and refused. Unfazed, the Sibyl walked away, burned 3 of the books and returned, offering the remaining 6 for the exact same original price. The king, now both amused and irritated, refused again, certain she was trying to swindle him. The old woman left, burned 3 more books, and returned one last time with only 3 remaining. She asked for the same sum of gold for this final third of the original treasure. This time, something shifted in the king. Perhaps it was the unsettling confidence of the woman, the sheer audacity of her actions, or a dawning, superstitious dread. He consulted his augurs, the official state diviners, who were horrified by his previous dismissals. They warned him that to reject this final offer would be an unforgivable affront to the gods. Heeding their advice, a chastened Tarquinius paid the full, original price for the 3 surviving books. With this transaction, Rome acquired the Sibylline books, and the Sibyl vanished from history, her purpose fulfilled. Her tragic life had been spent to deliver a warning that was only partially received, a masterpiece of prophecy forever incomplete. These 3 books were immediately treated with the utmost solemnity. They were placed in a stone chest beneath the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, under the guard of a special commission of 2, later 10, and finally 15 patrician men. Their use was governed by strict sacred law. They were never to be consulted for personal gain or trivial matters. They could only be opened by their guardians on the direct order of the Roman Senate, and only when the Republic was facing an existential threat, a devastating plague, a terrifying omen, or the approach of a seemingly invincible enemy army. The ritual was one of grave seriousness. The keepers would unseal the chest, carefully unroll the brittle, ancient texts, and search for a specific verse that pertained to the current crisis. The prescription was never a simple prediction of victory or defeat. It was always a directive for a specific, often bizarre, religious rite that had to be performed to appease the gods. For centuries, this strange practice was Rome's secret weapon. When a shower of stones fell from a clear sky, the books were consulted and prescribed a 9-day religious festival, the Novundiel, a tradition that continued for centuries after. When the city was gripped by a mysterious plague, the books called for the introduction of a new healing god to the Roman pantheon, leading to the construction of a temple for Apollo Medicus. Their most famous prescription came during the Second Punic War, when the Carthaginian general Hannibal annihilated Roman legions at Cannae and stood at the very gates of the city. In its darkest hour, the Senate turned to the Sibylline books. The verses they found did not advise on military strategy. They commanded a truly extreme act of religious devotion: the live burial of 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks in the city's cattle market, a human sacrifice to the underworld gods to secure the survival of the Republic. This horrific act, a stark reminder of the brutal logic of the ancient world, was carried out without question. Whether through divine intervention or sheer resilience, Rome survived Hannibal. The ultimate tragedy of the Sibyl's story, however, is that her books, like her own life, were not destined to last. The great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, which had housed the sacred texts for nearly 400 years, caught fire in the year 83 BC. The flames consumed the building, and the original Sibylline books were lost forever. The Roman Senate, desperate to regain this divine guide, sent envoys across the known world to every major oracle site, to Erythri, to Delphi, to Libya, to collect any and all sayings attributed to prophetic Sibyls. These fragments were gathered and brought back to Rome, where a new compiled collection was created and stored in the rebuilt Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill. But these were copies, echoes of echoes. They lacked the terrifying authority and awful completeness of the original 3 books purchased from the mysterious old woman at such a terrible cost. This new collection was consulted for centuries more, even by the first Christian emperors, before it was finally ordered destroyed by the general Flavius Stilicho in the 4th century AD, viewed as a dangerous pagan relic. The Sibyl's voice, which had guided Rome through its greatest trials, was silenced for good. its fragments scattered to the winds just like the oak leaves in her cave, a perfect and poignant echo of its fragile beginning. But beyond dreams and riddles, the ancient world held a far more visceral form of prophecy, one that required not a sacred spring, but a sharp knife and a strong stomach. This was the art of extispicy, the practice of divining the future by reading the entrails of a sacrificed animal. For the pragmatic minds of Greece and Rome, this was not a dark superstition, but a sophisticated and systematic science, a way to literally hold the will of the gods in your hands and examine it for signs. The ritual was precise and deeply ceremonial. A flawless animal, a sheep, a goat, or for the most critical state matters, a bull would be selected, its perfection a prerequisite for attracting the divine gaze. It would be decorated with garlands, its head sprinkled with sacred meal and water to ensure it nodded its consent to the sacrifice, a crucial legal and religious formality. Then, with a single, practiced stroke, the priest would open its throat, catching the blood in a special bowl. The real work began as the haruspex, the specialist diviner, carefully laid the still warm liver, lungs, and heart on a special altar for inspection. This was not a random search for bizarre shapes, it was a meticulous reading of a divine map. The liver, believed to be the seat of life and emotion, was the primary text. It was mentally divided into specific zones, a Chinese letter to a different god or aspect of human endeavor. A healthy, smooth, and symmetrical liver was the ultimate good omen, a resounding yes from the heavens. But any deviation from this perfection was a message to be decoded. A lobe that was too small or misshapen might predict a weak flank in an upcoming battle. A strange discoloration or a cyst could indicate divine displeasure with a proposed law. The gallbladder's size and placement held meaning, as did the texture of the lungs and the structure of the heart. The haruspex was a master anatomist, a theologian, and a political analyst all rolled into one, tasked with translating the complex biology of a dead animal into a clear directive for the living. The weight of this responsibility was never heavier than on a summer day in the year 415 BC, as the great Athenian fleet prepared to launch its ambitious and controversial invasion of Sicily. The expedition's commander, the brilliant but arrogant General Alcibiades, was determined to proceed, but the traditional sacrifices before departure were yielding deeply troubling signs. The haruspices reported that the livers of the sacrificed animals were unfavorable or diseased, showing clear markings of obstruction and ill fortune. For most military leaders, this would have been an immediate stop order, a direct divine veto, but Alcibiades was not most men. Surrounded by eager, ambitious young soldiers and facing political pressure from home, he chose to challenge the reading. He allegedly arranged for new sacrifices to be performed until, finally, a more ambiguous set of entrails could be interpreted in a positive light by a more compliant or pressured priest. His forces set sail under a cloud of religious doubt, a doubt that would soon crystallize into one of the most catastrophic military disasters in ancient history. The entire expeditionary force was eventually trapped, captured, or killed, its ships destroyed in the harbor of Syracuse. The initial unfavorable entrails were, in hindsight, a brutally accurate forecast of the hubris and doom that awaited them. The Romans elevated this practice to an even higher degree of statecraft. No major public action, no election, no declaration of war, no passage of a significant law could proceed without first taking the auspicia, the signs from the gods, often through bird observation but critically through extispicy before battle. The story of the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher on the eve of the Battle of Drepana during the First Punic War serves as a stark warning against ignoring this practice. Determined to engage the Carthaginian fleet, Claudius ordered the sacred chickens to be fed. Their willingness to eat was a vital omen. If they ate greedily, the gods favored the action. On this day, however, the birds, seasick from the rolling waves, refused to touch their food. Furious at this divine reluctance, the consul reportedly threw the sacred chickens overboard, snarling, "If they will not eat, then let them drink." He engaged the Carthaginians and suffered a humiliating and crushing defeat, a loss blamed squarely on his impious dismissal of the gods' warning. For Rome, this was not a superstition. It was a fundamental check on human arrogance, a system that forced even the most powerful men to pause and seek a sign of divine consent before committing the state to irreversible action. The entrails of a single sheep could and did halt entire legions, proving that in the ancient world, the smallest details of the natural world were never just details. They were the handwriting of the gods, waiting to be read by those willing to look. This reliance on divine guidance was perhaps nowhere more critical than in the ambitious, perilous enterprise of founding a new city. For the ancient Greeks, establishing a colony was not a mere land grab. It was a sacred act of replication, an attempt to create a tiny piece of Hellas in the wild, unknown frontiers of the world. The stakes were astronomically high. A poorly chosen site could mean starvation, hostile encounters with local populations, or simply slow obscurity. With the fortunes of the mother city and the lives of hundreds of settlers on the line, no mortal leader would dare trust their own judgment alone. The entire venture, from conception to departure, was steeped in religion, and the final, crucial decision of where to build was almost universally entrusted to an oracle. The process began when a city, often pressured by overpopulation or political strife, would decide to send out a colony. They would appoint a leader, the oikistes, a man of high standing who would carry the immense responsibility for the mission's success. But before a single ship was provisioned, the oikistes would journey to a major oracle, most often Delphi, to seek Apollo's blessing and, most importantly, his directions. The question was not if they should go, but where. The Pythia's response was rarely a set of GPS coordinates. Instead, it was typically a poetic riddle, a phrase that the leader would have to carry with him and interpret correctly upon finding the destined location. One of the most famous examples involves the founding of Cyrene in North Africa. The settlers from the island of Thera were given a notoriously vague instruction to found their city in a place where they would be showered with rain from a clear blue sky. After a long and frustrating search along the coast of Libya, the meaning suddenly became clear. They came upon a lush, verdant plateau soaring high above the arid coastline, fed by a natural spring that sent a fine, misty spray into the air, creating a perpetual rainbow and a constant, gentle rain under the blazing North African sun. They had found their miraculous rain from a clear sky. The site was not only symbolically perfect, but also strategically and agriculturally ideal, becoming one of the richest Greek colonies. Another colony, directed to found a city at the place of the wild boar, searched until they saw a lone boar emerge from a dense thicket, leading them to a sheltered cove with a reliable freshwater spring, the two absolute necessities for a new settlement. Yet another group was told to settle where they were invited to dinner by the natives. This initially seemed like a hopeful metaphor until their scouts, lost and starving, were genuinely discovered and offered a feast of lentils by a local tribe. They took this act of hospitality as the definitive sign and built their city there. The sheer number of successful colonies founded on such obscure advice forces us to look beyond mere coincidence and consider a more sophisticated system at work. The priests of Delphi were not just channeling divine chaos, they were arguably the best-informed intelligence network in the ancient Mediterranean. As travelers, merchants, and diplomats from across the known world came to consult the oracle, they brought with them a wealth of tacit knowledge, unwritten reports on geography, climate, resources, and the political landscapes of distant regions. The priests would have synthesized this constant flow of information, building a mental database of the known world. When a colonist asked for a location, the Pythia's cryptic verse may have been a carefully coded message based on this intelligence. A prophecy pointing to a white-haired man or a goat might have been a reference to the white cliffs or the mountain goats a scout had described in a particular bay. The riddles served a practical purpose. They protected Delphic credibility. If the colony succeeded, the oracle was praised for its divine foresight. If it failed, the blame could be placed on the colonists for misinterpreting the riddle, not on the god for providing bad information. This system allowed Delphi to guide the spread of Greek culture with remarkable accuracy, its verses acting as a combination of divine mandate and encrypted travel advisory, ensuring that new cities were founded not just with hope, but with the best available knowledge of the time. While the grand oracles of Apollo and Zeus operated in the bright, public eye of the ancient world, guiding kings and shaping empires, there existed another, more intimate tier of prophecy hidden from the view of men. In the quiet, fertile regions of the Greek world, far from the political machinations of Delphi, were sanctuaries dedicated solely to the goddesses, spaces where the divine voice was not just channeled by women, but heard exclusively by them. Among the most mysterious of these was the Oracle of Demeter at Patri, a sacred site that defied the patriarchal norms of its time by creating a world where female experience was not just acknowledged, but centered as the ultimate source of spiritual authority. This was no sun-drenched temple open to all pilgrims. The sanctuary at Patri was a closed, secretive world, a spiritual refuge operated by and for women, dedicated to Demeter, the powerful goddess of the harvest, fertility, and the sacred, unbreakable bond between mother and child. Here, the rituals were not about affairs of state or military conquest. They dealt with the profound, often terrifying, transitions of a woman's life: marriage, childbirth, sickness, and the overwhelming fear of losing a child to disease or famine. The priestesses who presided were not temporary vessels like the Pythia. They were likely older, experienced women who had weathered these storms themselves, now serving as spiritual guides and interpreters of the goddesses' will for a community of supplicants who shared their lived experiences. The consultations themselves were shrouded in absolute secrecy, a practice the Greeks called areta, meaning the unspeakable things. Men were strictly forbidden from entering the sacred precincts during these rites. Our limited knowledge of what transpired comes from scattered hints in ancient texts and inscriptions, piecing together a picture of a deeply somatic and emotional form of divination. Unlike the male priests at Delphi who interpreted the ravings of the Pythia, the priestesses of Demeter likely used methods that resonated with the physical realities of womanhood. They might have interpreted the patterns of seeds scattered on a sacred cloth, the behavior of sacred snakes, creatures intimately associated with the earth and the underworld, or the movements of a consecrated child in a ritual trance. The focus was on dreams, intuition, and the body's own wisdom, ways of knowing that were often dismissed in the rational, public sphere of male society but were revered within these walls. The power of this female-only space cannot be overstated. In a culture where a woman's life was largely defined by her relationship to men, as a daughter, a wife, a mother, the oracle at Patri offered a rare and precious autonomy. It was a place where women could speak freely about their deepest fears and desires without male judgment or oversight. A young bride terrified of her wedding night, a mother desperate to conceive a son, a woman grieving a stillbirth, these were the crises that brought them to the sanctuary. They sought not a riddle to be decoded, but comfort, guidance, and the powerful reassurance that their struggles were seen and validated by the divine feminine itself. The oracle provided a framework for understanding the traumas of their lives not as personal failures, but as part of a larger, sacred cycle governed by Demeter and her daughter Persephone, a cycle of loss, renewal, and enduring strength. This hidden network of female oracles reveals a sophisticated spiritual counterculture operating parallel to the famous male-dominated institutions. While the priests of Apollo advised on war and politics, the priestesses of Demeter were tending to the internal battles of the heart and home, proving that the ancient world's conception of prophecy was far more diverse and nuanced than the famous legends suggest. These sanctuaries were not just sites of divination, they were vital support systems, counseling centers, and a powerful affirmation that the most urgent truths are sometimes those whispered only among women in the sacred dark far from the public eye. The spirit of competition that burned brightest in the ancient world was not lit solely by human ambition. It was a sacred flame kindled and sanctioned by the gods. Every 4 years, the fierce rivalries between the Greek city-states were set aside, not by the decree of any king, but by a divine mandate known as the sacred truce or ekacharia. And this universal ceasefire, which allowed athletes and spectators to travel safely to Olympia, was itself established on the authority of an oracle. The story goes that in the 9th century BC, King Aphetos of Elis, weary of the endless wars and plagues ravaging the Peloponnese, journeyed to Delphi to seek a solution from the Pythia. Her response was a visionary command to revive the ancient athletic contests in honor of Zeus at Olympia and to proclaim a truce for the duration of the games. This was not a suggestion, it was a divine law. Messengers known as spondophoroi were then sent out from Elis to every corner of the Greek world, announcing the dates of the games and the inviolable truce. To attack a traveler during this period was not just a political crime, it was an act of sacrilege against Zeus himself, punishable by fines and exclusion from future competitions. The Oracle's Council transformed a local festival into a pan-Hellenic institution, creating a fragile but powerful island of peace in a sea of perpetual conflict, where the only battles fought were on the racetrack and the wrestling grounds. The connection between athletics and prophecy ran far deeper than just the truce. For the competitors, the difference between immortal glory and forgotten defeat could hinge on a fraction of a second or a single misstep. In this high-stakes environment, where physical training was only part of the equation, many sought a divine edge. Oracles were frequently consulted by athletes and their trainers for advice on everything from diet and exercise regimens to the most auspicious time to compete. A famous anecdote tells of the wrestler Milo of Croton, a man of legendary strength who won 6 Olympic victories. It was said that his unique training method of carrying a newborn calf on his shoulders every day until it grew into a full-sized bull was a strategy endorsed by the Oracle at Delphi. This seemingly superhuman feat was less about brute force and more about progressive overload, a principle of modern athletic training wrapped in the guise of divine instruction. The Oracle's endorsement provided not just a plan, but the psychological certainty that the method was blessed by the gods, fueling the athlete's conviction and perseverance. Perhaps the most fascinating prophecies were those concerning the athletes themselves, foretelling their future glory. The great boxer and pancratiast Thegenes of Thossos was said to have been destined for greatness from childhood. As a young boy, he reportedly stole a bronze statue of a god from the agora and carried it home. The outraged townspeople demanded the statue be returned and the boy punished, but a local oracle intervened with a startling pronunciation. They declared that the boy should simply return the statue to its place and make a sacrifice, for his incredible act of strength was a sign of divine favor. The oracle prophesied that Thegenes would go on to become one of the most celebrated athletes of all time, which he did, winning over 1,300 victories in various games. This story served a crucial purpose. It framed his almost inhuman prowess not as something frightening or unnatural, but as a preordained gift from the gods, transforming a potential delinquent into a local hero chosen by destiny. Victorious athletes often publicly credited their success to the Council of Oracles, weaving the divine directly into their narratives of triumph. After a win, it was common for an athlete to dedicate a portion of their spoils, a statue, a ceremonial bowl, or a portion of the prize money, to the sanctuary that had guided them. These votive offerings, often inscribed with thanks to both the god and the oracle, were powerful propaganda. They solidified the winner's legacy by connecting their personal achievement to the cosmic order, suggesting their victory was not just earned but fated. For the audience and for future competitors, these stories reinforced the idea that true greatness required more than physical training. It demanded alignment with the will of the gods, sought through the cryptic channels of prophecy. The oracle's role in the games ultimately reveals that for the ancient Greeks, athletic perfection was a holistic pursuit, a sacred endeavor where the strength of the body, the discipline of the mind, and the favor of the divine were inextricably linked. Yet for all the life-saving public health mandates and the strategic military advice, the defining characteristic of the most famous oracles was not clarity, but deliberate, masterful ambiguity. This wasn't a flaw in the system, it was its greatest and most sophisticated feature. The cryptic, riddle-like nature of so many prophecies served a profound dual purpose. It protected the sanctity and reputation of the oracle, while also offering a crucial layer of protection for the supplicants themselves, often saving them from their own reckless ambitions. No story illustrates this dangerous dance with a double-edged prophecy better than that of Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia, whose tale became the ultimate cautionary tale about the perils of misinterpretation. Drunk on his own immense power and riches, Croesus grew paranoid about the rising Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Determined to strike first, he sought divine sanction for what was essentially a war of aggression. Being a meticulous man, he first tested the major oracles of the known world, sending emissaries to Delphi, Dodona, and even the oracle of Ammon in Libya with a specific instruction. On the 100th day after their departure from his capital Sardis, they were to ask what the king was doing at that very moment. He then devised an impossible test. He chopped up a tortoise and a lamb and boiled them together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid. The response from the Pythia at Delphi was phenomenally accurate. She declared, "I count the grains of sand on the beach and measure the sea. I understand the speech of the dumb and hear the voiceless. The smell has come to my sense of a hard-shelled tortoise boiling and bubbling with a lamb's flesh in a bronze pot with another bronze lid below." Astounded by this precise and impossible knowledge, Croesus showered Delphi with breathtaking gifts, ingots of gold, a lion statue made of solid gold, and countless other treasures, securing what he believed was a firm alliance with Apollo. He then asked his real question: would he be successful if he made war on the Persians? The oracle's response was a masterpiece of divine poetry and legal loopholes. She declared that if Croesus made war on the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Elated, and hearing only what he wanted to hear, Croesus launched his invasion, confident of victory. The resulting war, however, was a disaster. After an inconclusive battle, he retreated to Sardis, which was then besieged and captured by Cyrus. Croesus found himself chained and placed upon a funeral pyre to be burned alive. As the flames licked at his feet, he finally understood the true meaning of the prophecy. The great empire he had destroyed was his own. In his despair, he cried out the name of the lawgiver Solon, who had once warned him that no man could be called happy until his life had ended well. Cyrus, intrigued by this, spared his life and reportedly kept him as an advisor, but the lesson was etched in fire and ash. The oracle had spoken the truth, but its meaning was contingent on the listener's own actions and biases. This famous story reveals the genius of the oracle's ambiguity. From the institution's perspective, the prophecy was unimpeachable. It was factually correct regardless of the outcome. If Croesus won, he destroyed the Persian Empire. If he lost, he destroyed his own. The oracle's reputation remained intact, its authority untouched by the failure of a mortal king to correctly divine the will of the gods. But the ambiguity also served a deeper, more protective function for other, less powerful supplicants. For every proud king like Croesus asking about war, there were dozens of ordinary people asking questions that could get them killed. A citizen asking if he should join a political conspiracy against a tyrant needed an answer that would not condemn him if the plot was discovered. A slave inquiring about the possibility of freedom needed counsel that wouldn't incite his master's wrath. A clear yes or no could be a death sentence. A riddle, however, provided plausible deniability. The response could be a line of poetry about a ship finding safe harbor only after a storm, or the harvest being reaped under a waning moon. To the conspirator, this might mean success would come after a period of difficulty. To a tyrant spy overhearing it, it might sound like harmless spiritual advice. The oracle's ambiguity acted as a divine encryption, a safety mechanism that delivered wisdom only to those with the humility and wisdom to understand it, while protecting the foolish and the reckless from their own hubris and the vulnerable from the powerful. It was the ultimate test of character, forcing the seeker to look inward and confront their own desires and fears before acting, ensuring that the most dangerous truths were only revealed to those prepared to handle them with care. The reach of the Greek oracles extended far beyond the jagged coastline of the mainland, casting a long shadow across the entire Mediterranean world and drawing the attention of the most powerful and wealthiest rulers of the age. This international fame, particularly of Delphi, transformed the sanctuary into a stage for high-stakes diplomacy, where the soft power of religious authority met the hard realities of geopolitics. When a foreign monarch like King Croesus of Lydia, whose kingdom lay in what is now modern Turkey, decided to consult a Greek oracle, it was never a simple matter of spiritual curiosity. It was a calculated political maneuver, a way to publicly align himself with the most prestigious divine brand in the known world, thereby legitimizing his rule and his ambitions in the eyes of both his subjects and his rivals. His famous test of the oracles, sending emissaries to ask what he was doing on a specific day, was as much about verifying the god's power as it was about auditing the quality of the intelligence network he was about to buy into. By choosing Delphi as the winner and showering it with unimaginable wealth, solid gold statues, ingots, and a breathtaking base of 117 gold bricks, Croesus wasn't just paying for a prophecy. He was purchasing a political alliance with Apollo himself, a celestial endorsement that he could wield against his enemies. The process for these high-level foreign consultations was fraught with complex, unspoken protocols. A foreign king couldn't simply send a letter. He would dispatch a formal delegation, an embassy of high-ranking nobles and priests led by a trusted confidant, whose journey to Delphi was a public spectacle in itself, announcing to every city-state along the way that a major power was seeking Greek favor. Upon arrival, these delegates would be received not just by the priests, but by the highest officials of the Delphic Pythia, the league of city-states that administered the sanctuary. The question posed to the Pythia would have been carefully drafted and vetted by both the sender and the recipient, a delicate dance of wording designed to yield a useful answer without forcing the oracle into a politically untenable position. The resulting prophecy, often ambiguous, would then be carried back by the delegation, its interpretation becoming a matter of statecraft back in the royal court. For the Delphic priests, managing these foreign relations was a tightrope walk. A prophecy that too blatantly favored one foreign power over another could alienate Greek city-states, while one that was too vague could be seen as worthless by the wealthy patron who funded the temple's operations. Their genius lay in crafting responses that maintained the gods' neutral authority while allowing the powerful to hear what they needed to hear. This intricate dance of faith and foreign policy wasn't limited to the Lydians. Pharaoh Amosis of Egypt, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler in the 6th century BC, also recognized the value of cultivating a relationship with Delphi. His donations were strategically brilliant. Instead of just sending gold, he commissioned 1,000 talents of alum, a critical mineral used in medicine and textile dyeing, for the sanctuary's use and for sale to the Greeks. This was a gift of immense practical value that also subtly boosted Egyptian trade and influence. Later, when his famous polymath advisor, Pythagoras, sought to travel and study, Amasis provided him with letters of introduction specifically to the priests of Delphi, treating them as esteemed academic colleagues in an international network of wisdom. These actions reveal a sophisticated understanding of soft power. For Pharaoh Amasis, Delphi was not merely a temple, it was a key node in a nascent global network of influence, a place where intellectual, economic, and religious authority converged. By investing in it, he was investing in his own reputation as an enlightened and cosmopolitan leader, respected from the Nile to Mount Parnassus. The presence of these foreign delegations fundamentally altered the physical and cultural landscape of the major oracles. The Sacred Way at Delphi became a veritable museum of international diplomacy, lined with magnificent treasure houses and dedications not from Greek cities but from foreign kingdoms. The Siphnian treasury was funded by gold and silver mines, but the nearby Cnidian treasury was built by a Greek city in Asia Minor, showcasing Eastern architectural influences. Even more directly, the treasury of the Corinthians was allegedly built with a tithe from the spoils of a war against their Greek rivals, but its very existence was a statement to every foreign delegate who passed it about the wealth and power of its sponsors. These structures were not just offerings, they were permanent embassies in stone, asserting a kingdom's presence and piety at the most pan-Hellenic site imaginable. They served as constant reminders to all Greek visitors that their local oracles held a truly international prestige, making the gods of Greece not just regional deities, but players on a world stage, their favor sought by the mightiest empires of the day. This influx of foreign wealth and interest didn't diminish the oracle's Hellenic identity. Instead, it amplified it, proving that the voice from the crack in the earth at Delphi was considered the ultimate authority, a universal touchstone of truth for the entire ancient world. But the search for divine signs was not limited to the entrails of animals or the ravings of a priestess. For some oracles, the entire cosmos itself was the text to be read. Nestled in the gentle hills of Boeotia near the town of Oropus lay the sanctuary of Amphiaraus, a hero and seer who was said to have been swallowed by the earth during a great battle and granted the gift of prophecy by Zeus. This oracle operated on a principle that was unique in the ancient world. It specialized in the interpretation of dreams, but its priests possessed an extraordinary additional skill. They were masters of celestial observation, correlating the movements of planets and stars with the visions experienced by seekers during their sacred incubation, creating a sophisticated system of astrological medicine that was centuries ahead of its time. The process for a seeker was deeply immersive. After purifying themselves and making sacrifices to Amphiaraus, they would bring a ram to the altar, sacrificing it and spreading its skin upon the ground. They would then lie upon this hide to sleep, praying for a healing or prophetic dream from the hero god. But when they awoke to recount their often symbolic and confusing visions, the priests did not rely on intuition alone. They would consult intricate charts and records, meticulously comparing the patient's dream imagery with the precise positions of the celestial bodies on that specific night. A dream of a crashing chariot might be interpreted one way if it occurred under a full moon in the constellation of Sagittarius, the Archer, and quite another if it happened when Mars was in retrograde. They believed that the macrocosm of the heavens and the microcosm of the human body were intimately linked, and that planetary alignments could influence both health and destiny. What is truly astonishing is the accuracy of the astronomical knowledge these priests must have possessed to make such correlations. Through generations of patient, naked eye observation, they had mapped the complex, wandering paths of the planets against the fixed backdrop of the stars. They understood the concept of planetary retrogradation, the apparent backward motion of a planet in the sky long before it was formally explained by Hellenistic astronomers. They tracked the cycles of Venus as both the morning and evening star, recognized the distinctive red hue of Mars, and could predict the approximate timing of lunar eclipses. This was not merely stargazing, it was a rigorous, data-driven science applied to the art of prophecy. Their ability to link a specific dream symbol to a specific celestial event implies they maintained detailed, long-term records, effectively creating an ancient database of astrological and medical correlations. This practice reveals a fascinating and surprisingly modern-seeming approach to diagnosis. The priests of Amphiaraus were essentially practicing an early form of holistic medicine, considering external, environmental factors, in this case the cosmos itself, as integral to understanding an individual's ailment. A patient complaining of sudden, acute pain might have had a dream of being pierced by an arrow, which the priests could then connect to the aggressive influence of Mars dominating the night sky. Their prescribed treatment might therefore involve cooling herbs and rest to counteract this perceived martial inflammation. While the underlying astrological theory may not align with modern science, the methodology was remarkably sophisticated. Observe patterns, keep records, and cross-reference symptoms with external data to form a diagnosis. It was a system that acknowledged the human body as part of a larger, interconnected universe, and that the keys to healing might be found not just within, but written in the stars above. In the high-stakes arena of ancient Greek warfare, where a single battle could erase a city-state from the map, the decision to march was never made lightly in a council of war alone. It was made in the hushed, smoky presence of an oracle. Before a single spear was sharpened or a single trireme launched, emissaries from the feuding states would often make the arduous journey to a sanctuary like Delphi, seeking not just a prediction of victory, but something far more crucial: divine sanction. This process transformed the oracle from a mere fortune teller into the ancient world's highest court of appeal, a neutral ground where priests acted as the first true diplomatic mediators, using the voice of the god to enforce rules of engagement that all parties were bound to respect. The questions posed by these state delegations were meticulously crafted. They rarely asked, "Will we win?" Such a question was too blunt, too risky for the oracle's reputation. Instead, they framed their inquiries with precise, conditional piety. A typical question might be, "O Apollo, if we dedicate 1/10 of the spoils to your temple and march against the Spartans in the next full moon, will you grant us your favor?" This phrasing offered the god a tangible incentive and allowed the Pythia's response to be equally conditional. A positive reply was a green light, a divine contract that promised support if the terms were met. A negative or ambiguous response, however, could halt an army in its tracks, as proceeding without divine blessing was seen as suicidal hubris. The priestly core at these major oracles were, out of necessity, masterful diplomats and intelligence analysts. As representatives from every corner of Greece passed through their halls, they accumulated a deep, real-time understanding of international tensions, military capabilities, and political alliances. When two rival states consulted on the same conflict, the priests were uniquely positioned to craft responses that could de-escalate the situation. A famous, though likely apocryphal, story illustrates this perfectly. When both the Athenians and the Spartans sought Apollo's blessing for the looming Peloponnesian War, the Pythia was said to have given each a prophecy that played to their strengths and fears. To the Spartans, she allegedly promised that they would be victorious if they fought with all their might. To the Athenians, she offered the famously ambiguous assurance that the wooden walls would protect them. This allowed both sides to march to war believing they had divine backing, but the true genius was in the ambiguity for Athens. The wooden walls were later interpreted by the strategist Themistocles to mean their fleet of ships, an interpretation that saved the city by focusing their defense on a naval strategy that ultimately proved successful. The oracle hadn't chosen a side, it had provided each state with a strategic concept that would define their approach to the coming conflict, effectively managing the war's conduct from its very inception. This mediating function extended to establishing the very rules of war. The sacred truces surrounding major athletic games like the Olympics are the most famous example, but oracles also sanctioned more nuanced diplomatic instruments. They could prescribe the duration of a conflict, advise on the treatment of prisoners, and even dictate the terms of peace treaties. A city that had been wronged might be told by the oracle to seek not annihilation of their enemy, but a specific restitution. Perhaps the return of a disputed borderland or the payment of a fine to be dedicated to the god's temple. This transformed a raw political demand into a divine commandment, making it far harder for the offending party to refuse without risking the wrath of the gods. In this way, the oracle's pronouncements became the bedrock of international law, a way to contain the boundless brutality of war within a framework of religious obligation and mutual respect. The priests, by interpreting the god's will, weren't just foreseeing the future. They were actively shaping it, using their unparalleled moral authority to enforce a code of conduct that helped prevent the endless cycles of total destruction that might have otherwise consumed the Greek world. Yet for all its spiritual and diplomatic power, the true engine behind the Delphic oracle's enduring influence may have been something far more worldly and meticulously organized, a sophisticated financial empire operating from within the sacred temple complex. We often picture a place of pure mystical energy, but the archaeological evidence paints a different, equally fascinating picture. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, excavators unearthed thousands of stone inscriptions at Delphi, many of which were not prophecies or hymns, but painstakingly detailed financial records. These stone ledgers, chiseled in marble for permanent public display, revealed that the sanctuary of Apollo was, in essence, one of the most powerful and trusted banking institutions of the ancient world, managing a flow of capital that would rival modern investment firms. The wealth that poured into Delphi was staggering and came from a multitude of sources. There were the breathtaking dedications from grateful kings like Croesus, of course. But beyond these legendary one-off gifts, the oracle had a steady and massive income stream from the countless consultations themselves. While some sources suggest a fee was charged for asking a question, the real financial engine was the mandatory sacrifice. Before any consultation, a supplicant had to offer a specific animal, a goat for a private question, a much more expensive bull for a state inquiry. The temple then retained the hides, the meat, and the valuable fat from these sacrifices, which could be sold off in bulk, creating a constant, renewable source of revenue from the endless stream of pilgrims. Furthermore, every victorious athlete, every general who won a battle based on Delphic advice, and every colony that succeeded was expected to send a tithe, a tenth of their spoils, back to the god. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth. The more successful the oracle's prophecies, the richer it became, allowing it to expand its influence and attract even more clients. This immense and ever-growing treasury was not left to gather dust in a vault. The priests of Delphi became masterful asset managers. The inscriptions show they engaged in a wide range of financial activities, the most significant of which was lending money at interest to both city-states and private individuals. For a Greek polis facing a sudden famine or needing to fund the construction of new defensive walls, taking out a loan from Delphi was a logical and attractive option. The oracle's neutrality made it a safe creditor, unlikely to use debt as a political weapon. The terms of these loans were made public on those stone steels, detailing the principal amount, the interest rate, which was typically a reasonable 10%, the repayment schedule, and the names of the officials who guaranteed the city's credit. This public record-keeping was a brilliant innovation. It created transparency and immense social pressure on borrowers to repay their debt to the god, lest they face not just financial penalty but divine wrath and public shame. The scope of their financial dealings was astonishingly modern. Beyond simple loans, the temple also accepted deposits for safekeeping. Wealthy individuals, wary of keeping their fortunes at home where they could be stolen or confiscated, could entrust their assets to the temple's secure vaults. The priests would then put this deposited capital to work, lending it out and generating returns. They managed endowment funds for other smaller sanctuaries, invested in lucrative land acquisitions, and even financed large-scale infrastructure projects like the drainage works that kept the sacred spring flowing. This complex financial ecosystem required a full-time administrative staff of accountants, scribes, and treasurers who worked alongside the priests, turning the sanctuary into a hybrid of a Wall Street bank, a Federal Reserve, and a sacred trust. The brilliance of this system was its self-reinforcing nature. The oracle's perceived spiritual authority provided the bedrock of trust upon which its entire financial operation was built. No one would dare default on a loan to Apollo, and everyone believed their money was safer in his temple than anywhere else. In turn, the vast wealth generated by these banking activities funded the maintenance and expansion of the sanctuary, paid for the priests and Pythias, and financed the lavish festivals that kept Delphi at the center of Greek cultural life. This economic power also granted the oracle a form of political influence that was far more subtle and durable than any single prophecy. A city-state indebted to Delphi was far more likely to vote in line with its interests in the Amphictyonic Council. The flow of capital became another tool of soft power, allowing the priests to stabilize friendly governments by extending credit or to gently pressure rivals by calling in debts. The voice from the tripod may have delivered the prophecies, but it was the endless, silent clinking of coins and the meticulous scratching of stelae on wax tablets in the temple's administrative offices that truly built and sustained the oracle's earthly dominion for centuries, proving that even the most divine of institutions must rest upon a foundation of impeccably managed wealth. While the oracles are often remembered for guiding kings and colonizers, their most profound and lasting influence may have been on a different kind of seeker entirely. The first philosophers, those men who dared to use reason to understand the nature of reality itself. The great sanctuaries were not merely religious sites, they were the ancient world's premier intellectual hubs, places where the brightest minds gathered, debated, and absorbed the cryptic wisdom of the gods, transforming it into the foundational ideas of Western thought. Nowhere is this clearer than in the work of two towering pre-Socratic thinkers, Heraclitus and Pythagoras, whose revolutionary concepts seem to flow directly from the oracle's paradoxical way of seeing the world. Heraclitus of Ephesus, known even in antiquity as the Obscure for his deliberately riddling style, wrote in a manner that directly echoed the Delphic priestess. His central doctrine was that reality is defined by constant, inevitable change, a concept he captured in his famous aphorism that you cannot step into the same river twice, for new waters are always flowing in. This wasn't just an observation about rivers, it was a radical metaphysical principle that the entire cosmos is in a state of perpetual flux, a ceaseless process of becoming. This idea resonates powerfully with the very essence of the oracular experience. The Pythia herself was a living embodiment of flux, a rational woman who temporarily became an ecstatic vessel for a god, her identity and voice in a state of constant transformation. The prophecies she delivered were not static statements of fact but fluid pronouncements whose meaning could change based on circumstance and interpretation. Just as Heraclitus believed a thing could be its own opposite depending on perspective. His most direct nod to this influence comes in another of his fragments where he states, "The Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither speaks nor conceals but gives a sign." Heraclitus saw the god's method not as deception, but as a sophisticated way of revealing a deeper truth about a universe that is itself inherently ambiguous and in motion, requiring active engagement from the seeker to be understood. If Heraclitus learned from the oracle's method, Pythagoras of Samos seems to have been inspired by its hidden architecture. Before founding his famous, secretive school in Croton, Pythagoras was a frequent pilgrim to Delphi, and ancient sources strongly suggest he was even employed by the temple for a time to reorganize its purification rituals. His time there would have exposed him to the complex mathematical harmony that underpinned the oracle's operations. The priests were master systematizers, dividing the liver into zones for divination, tracking celestial movements for the Amphirean, and managing vast financial ledgers with precise ratios. Pythagoras took this idea of a hidden order and universalized it, proclaiming that the entire cosmos was not built on physical matter, but on number and mathematical relationship. He famously discovered that the musical intervals the Greeks found most harmonious were produced by strings whose lengths were in simple whole number ratios, like 2:1 for an octave. He then extrapolated this, arguing that the same mathematical principles must govern the motion of the planets, the unheard music of the spheres, and even the nature of the human soul. This was a monumental leap, transforming the world from a chaotic playground of capricious gods into a comprehensible, rational system. The oracle's role in this was crucial. By demonstrating that the divine will could be decoded through a system of signs and rituals, it provided a model for Pythagoras. He simply took it further, proposing that the entire universe was a divine utterance to be decoded, not through sacrifice but through mathematics. His concept of the soul's transmigration and its need for purification through intellectual and dietary practices also mirrors the Delphic maxims, know thyself, and nothing in excess, suggesting a philosophical system where spiritual enlightenment was achieved through the understanding of cosmic mathematical laws, a direct evolution from the ritual purification required to approach the tripod. The temple precincts themselves facilitated this cross-pollination of ideas. Imagine the scene, in the shadow of the great temple, among the treasure houses built by rival city-states, would gather not only pilgrims but also poets, politicians, mathematicians, and natural philosophers. They would converse in the gymnasium, debate in the dining halls, and listen to the latest ideas after making their offerings. A man like Herodotus, the father of history, would have come to consult the oracle for his writings and ended up interviewing these very thinkers, weaving their novel theories into his accounts. The sanctuary was a neutral ground, a Panhellenic think tank where the most advanced ideas of the age were exposed to the potent, transformative influence of the divine. The oracles did not just predict events, they catalyzed a new way of thinking, providing the raw, mystical material that the greatest philosophical minds would then refine into the principles that still shape our understanding of the universe today, proving that the search for truth, whether through divine possession or rational inquiry, often begins with a question posed in the sacred dark. But beneath the public, sunlit world of Apollo and the sanctioned mysteries of state, there existed a far older, darker, and more secretive form of prophecy that operated under the pale light of the moon, far from the approving gaze of the polies. These were the night oracles of Hecate, the formidable goddess of magic, crossroads, and the restless dead. While the mainstream oracles worked within the civic and religious order, Hecate's rituals were deeply personal, transgressive, and often illegal, offering a direct line to the underworld for those desperate enough to cross the boundary between the living and the departed. Unlike the grand temples of Delphi or Dodona, her altars were simple, three-faced stone pillars known as hecatea, erected at lonely crossroads or before the gates of private homes, marking thresholds between the known world and the realm of spirits. The rituals themselves, known as necromantia or necromancy, were the antithesis of the orderly, priest-mediated consultations of the state oracles. They were performed in the dead of night, ideally during the dark of the new moon when the veil between worlds was believed to be at its thinnest. A seeker, driven by a grief or a need so powerful it overrode all fear of divine punishment, would arrive at a desolate crossroads with a specific offering, a supper of Hecate. This was not a grand sacrifice of a flawless bull, but a grim, haunting meal of bread, eggs, and fish, often the leftovers from a funeral feast, placed directly on the ground for the goddess and the spirit she commanded. The supplicant would then perform an elaborate invocation, calling upon Hecate and the specific spirit they wished to consult, all while drawing a ceremonial circle in the soil for protection against the very forces they were summoning. The goal was not to receive a riddle or a verse, but to force the ghost of the deceased to appear and answer questions directly. Ancient accounts describe these apparitions as shadowy, mute figures, unable to speak unless they drank from a sacrificial offering of blood, believed to be the temporary sustenance of the soul. The answers they provided were not about affairs of state or founding colonies. They were wrenchingly intimate. A mother might seek to learn if her deceased child was at peace. A betrayed heir might ask a dead parent to reveal the location of a hidden will. A merchant ruined by a silent partner's death could demand the password to a sealed strongbox. This was divination stripped of all civic pretense, a raw and dangerous transaction with the underworld to solve the most urgent private crises of the human heart. The fundamental difference between these practices and the mainstream oracles was one of control and authority. At Delphi, the process was managed and sanitized by a male priesthood who interpreted the god's will for the good of the community. The night oracles removed every intermediary. The individual confronted the divine and the dead directly, wielding their own will and magical formulae to compel an answer. This power, placed in the hands of ordinary people, and especially women, who were frequently practitioners of these arts, was seen as deeply threatening to the patriarchal and political order. It was a subversive, decentralized form of knowledge that bypassed the official channels of religion and state, which is why it was so often condemned and punishable by law. To consult the dead was to challenge the natural order, to steal secrets from the underworld that the living were not meant to possess. The accounts of these rituals, whispered in fear and fascination, remind us that the ancient desire to know the future could drive people not only to great sanctuaries, but also to lonely crossroads in the deep of night, willing to risk everything for a whispered answer from the other side. Yet the influence of these divine pronouncements extended far beyond the realms of politics and personal fate, weaving itself into the very fabric of Greek culture and giving birth to one of its most enduring art forms. The great tragedies performed in the theater of Dionysus at Athens were not merely entertainment. They were profound spiritual and civic explorations of the human condition, and at the heart of their most powerful plots lay the oft ambiguous will of the oracles. Playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles recognized that a Delphic prophecy was the perfect dramatic engine, a divine spark that could ignite a chain of events leading to ultimate ruin or revelation, forcing their characters to confront the limits of free will, the nature of justice, and the terrifying gap between human understanding and divine intention. In the hands of these masters, the theater itself became a kind of secular oracle, a public forum where the entire city could collectively grapple with the same moral and theological dilemmas that an individual faced in the tripod chamber at Delphi. Aeschylus, in his monumental austere trilogy, uses a chain of oracular commands to explore the inescapable nature of ancestral curse and the transition from primitive blood feud to civilized justice. The saga begins with Agamemnon, who is told by the seer cultures interpreting a sign from Artemis that he must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, to appease the goddess and allow the Greek fleet to sail for Troy. The prophecy places Agamemnon in an impossible situation, a tragic double bind: defy the god and fail his army, or obey and become a child murderer. His choice to sacrifice Iphigenia sets in motion a cycle of vengeance that culminates in his own murder by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her subsequent killing by their son, Orst. Orst himself is acting on a direct command from Apollo at Delphi, who orders him to avenge his father by matricide, thus ensuring he is both divinely sanctioned and utterly polluted by the act. The Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, then hunt him for his crime. The entire trilogy forces the audience to ask, if a man is compelled by an oracle to commit a horrendous act, is he truly guilty? The plays ultimately resolve this cosmic conflict not in a temple, but in an Athenian courtroom, with the goddess Athena casting the deciding vote to acquit Orsts, establishing a legal precedent over blind vengeance. Aeschylus uses the oracle's authority to start the story, but uses human reason and civic law to finish it, suggesting that while the gods may set the terms of our suffering, it is up to humanity to find a wiser way to resolve it. Sophocles takes this exploration of Delphic power to its most famous and devastating extreme in his Theban plays, particularly Oedipus Rex. The tragedy is arguably the greatest literary exploration of the perils of misinterpretation and the futility of escaping a divine decree. The play is a masterpiece of dramatic irony, built upon a prophecy given to King Laius and then to his son, Oedipus, that the boy would grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. Every human effort to avoid this fate, Laius ordering the infant exposed on a mountain, Oedipus fleeing the parents he believes are his own in Corinth, only serves to ensure its fulfillment. The central dramatic action of the play is not the acts themselves, but the process of discovery, the relentless investigation Oedipus launches to find the source of the miasma that has cursed Thebes. He is the detective pursuing his own guilt, and the clues all lead back to the oracle's original, unambiguous prophecy. The terrifying power of the play comes from the realization that the god's word was absolute and inescapable all along. Human intelligence and agency, embodied by the brilliant Oedipus, were utterly powerless to change it. The oracle's truth is a locked room, and Oedipus spends the entire play searching for the key, only to discover he has been inside it from the very beginning. However, Sophocles also demonstrates a more nuanced use of the oracle in his later play, Oedipus at Colonies. Here, the once accursed king, now a blind, wandering beggar, is granted a new personal prophecy from Apollo. He is told that his final resting place will become a blessing and a source of power for the city that shelters him. This prophecy sets off a desperate tug of war between his sons and the kings of Athens and Thebes, each wanting to possess the power of his tomb. In this play, the oracle is not a doom to be avoided, but a divine reward to be earned through piety and justice. The Athenians, represented by the noble king Theseus, offer Oedipus compassion and sanctuary without condition, and are thus granted the benefit. Sophocles, an Athenian himself, uses this oracle to make a powerful patriotic statement about the superiority of his city's values, showing that the gods reward righteous behavior. Through these plays, the theater became a medium for the democratic questioning of divine authority. The audience was invited to sit in judgment not of the characters but of the system itself. Was the oracle always just? Could its riddles be considered a form of divine cruelty? By staging these dilemmas, the playwrights were doing publicly what every Greek did privately, wrestling with the meaning of the gods' words. The chorus often represents this collective voice of the polis, reacting with fear, doubt, and ultimately, a humble acceptance of a cosmic order that often seemed incomprehensible from a human perspective. The tragic festival was a ritual in its own right, a civic purification where the community could experience the terror of fate and the catharsis of its resolution from the safety of the audience, emerging with a reinforced, if more complicated, faith in the structures that governed their world. The oracle provided the sacred text, but the theater became the place where that text was vigorously, painfully, and beautifully interpreted. Beyond the grand public pronouncements and the deeply personal quests for healing, the major oracles held another, more covert form of power, one that operated in the shadows of faith and pilgrimage. These sacred sites were not just spiritual centers, they were the ancient world's most sophisticated intelligence networks, where the flow of devoted pilgrims provided a perfect cover for the collection of military and political secrets. The very nature of the consultation process made them ideal for this purpose. A general from a distant city-state, a wealthy merchant with ties to a royal court, or a diplomat on a sensitive mission, all would need to appear at an oracle to seek divine guidance for their ventures, and in doing so, they inevitably brought valuable information with them, often revealing it in the very questions they asked. The priests who administered these sanctuaries were, by necessity, masters of this informal information economy. As the first point of contact for every high-ranking visitor, they were skilled at drawing out details through seemingly innocuous conversation before the formal consultation. A priest might ask a Spartan envoy about the difficulty of his journey, subtly probing for any news of blocked passes or unrest in the regions he traveled through. He might inquire after the health of a king, a question that could reveal much about political stability. These interactions allowed the priests to build a vast, constantly updated mental database of the Mediterranean world's geopolitical landscape, from harvest reports and grain shortages to rumors of troop movements and royal successions. This intelligence was not merely hoarded, it was actively used to shape the prophecies themselves, creating a powerful feedback loop. When the king of a powerful city-state arrived to ask about the wisdom of launching a naval campaign, the priests were rarely working from a blank slate. They likely already had reports from other visitors about the state of that king's shipyards, the morale of his people, or even the movements of his intended target. The resulting prophecy, therefore, was not born solely from divine inspiration, but from a synthesized, holistic assessment of the situation. An ambiguous response advising caution might subtly reflect verified reports of the enemy's unexpected strength, while an encouraging prophecy could be based on confirmed news of an ally's readiness to join the fight. The god's will and the priest's intelligence became indistinguishable, lending the weight of divine authority to what was in effect a highly informed strategic analysis. One of the most compelling potential examples of this involves the legendary King Croesus of Lydia and his famous test of the oracles. His decision to choose Delphi as the most accurate may have been less about mystical power and more about the quality of its intelligence apparatus. The precise, impossible knowledge of his bizarre cooking experiment, boiling a tortoise and a lamb in a bronze pot, suggests an incredibly efficient courier system. It is plausible that Croesus's own messengers or spies planted within his court by Delphic agents witnessed the king's strange act and raced to Delphi ahead of the official embassy to report every detail. This would have allowed the Pythia to appear omniscient, securing Croesus's lavish patronage, and more importantly, binding a fantastically wealthy and powerful foreign king firmly within Delphi's sphere of influence, guaranteeing a flow of valuable information from his kingdom for years to come. This function as a neutral clearinghouse for secrets also allowed oracles to act as passive channels of communication between hostile states. A Greek city under threat might send an envoy to Delphi with a question phrased for public consumption, but the real message was in the subtext of the inquiry itself. Simply by asking, "O Apollo, is this a propitious year to strengthen our city's walls?" a state was publicly signaling its perception of a threat, a signal that its enemies would be sure to hear and interpret. Conversely, an oracle could be used to send a veiled threat or an offer of truce. A prophecy delivered to one state that mentioned the swiftness of a deer or the patience of a farmer might be a coded warning or advice based on intelligence the priests had gathered from the other side, all under the unassailable cover of divine utterance. In this way, the smoky chamber of the Pythia became the ancient equivalent of a diplomatic backchannel, a place where wars could be prevented or sparked through the careful management of information disguised as the will of the gods. While the oracles of Apollo and Asclepius offered prophecies and dream cures, another profound form of healing echoed through the sacred valleys of Greece, one that required no words, no herbs, and no knives, but instead the transformative power of sound. This was the practice of musical therapy, a sophisticated understanding that the human soul could be harmonized and healed through precise sonic frequencies, and its most famous proponent was none other than the god Apollo himself, not in his aspect as the prophetic archer, but as Apollo Musagetes, the leader of the Muses. At his sanctuary in Delphi and at other lesser-known sites, music was not merely an accompaniment to ritual. It was the very instrument of divine medicine, a prescribed treatment for maladies of the mind and spirit that modern science is only now beginning to fully comprehend. The process was deeply integrated into the pilgrimage. A seeker arriving at Delphi, perhaps suffering from a deep melancholy or a frenzied anxiety, would first be cleansed in the waters of the Castalian spring. But the purification did not end there. They would then be led to a specific area of the sanctuary where musicians dedicated to the service of Apollo would perform. The primary instrument was the kithara, a sophisticated seven-stringed lyre, revered not for rhythmic accompaniment but for its ability to produce complex, resonant melodies. Unlike the raucous aulos, a double-reed pipe often associated with the ecstatic rites of Dionysus, the kithara's sound was considered orderly, mathematical, and Apollonian, a sonic representation of cosmic harmony. The musicians would play specific, traditional namoi or musical modes, each believed to possess a distinct emotional and physiological effect. The genius of this system lay in its targeted application, a concept the Greeks called ethos, meaning the power of music to influence character and emotion. Different musical modes were prescribed for opposite conditions. For a patient lost in a lethargic depression, a state the Greeks called lethargia, the priests might prescribe melodies composed in the passionate and stirring Dorian mode. This mode, which Plato later praised for its bravery and masculine quality, was designed to energize the spirit, to stir the blood, and to pull the patient out of their stupor by engaging their emotions. Conversely, for someone suffering from manic agitation or what might be called a hysterical frenzy, the treatment was the exact opposite. The musician would switch to the soothing, tranquilizing Phrygian mode. With its softer, more introspective intervals, this mode was believed to cool the fiery humors, slow the racing heart, and pacify a troubled mind, guiding it back to a state of calm equilibrium. The psychological impact on the ancient patient, steeped in a culture that believed utterly in the divine origin of music, must have been profound. This was not a passive concert, it was an active, participatory therapy session. The patient, already in a suggestible state from their pilgrimage and purification, would listen with intentionality, allowing the carefully structured vibrations to wash over them. The repetitive, mathematical patterns of the music, the ratios between string lengths that produced perfect fourths and fifths, would have entrained their brainwaves, slowing or quickening their heart rate and breathing in much the same way that modern sound therapy and binaural beats are used to reduce stress or enhance focus. The belief that this was a direct prescription from Apollo, the god of medicine, would have massively amplified the placebo effect, convincing the patient's own body to catalyze its healing process. The music became a divine tool, recalibrating the inner discord of the soul and aligning the individual once more with the harmonious order of the cosmos, proving that sometimes the most powerful prophecy is not a prediction of the future, but a prescription for a melody that can heal the wounds of the present. Even the most revered institutions were not immune to spectacular failure, and the true test of the oracle's power often came not when their predictions succeeded, but when they unequivocally collapsed. To maintain their divine authority in the face of a blatantly wrong prophecy, the priesthoods developed a sophisticated toolkit of reinterpretation, misdirection, and political maneuvering, revealing a fascinating and deeply human side to these supposedly divine institutions. One of the most glaring examples unfolded not in Greece, but in the heart of the rising Roman Republic, creating a crisis of faith that threatened to undermine the very foundations of their state religion. During the Second Punic War, as the Carthaginian general Hannibal marched his army and his war elephants across the Alps to bring the fight to Italy, the Roman Senate was gripped with terror. In a moment of desperation, they consulted the Sibylline books, seeking a divine weapon to counter this existential threat. The books prescribed a truly extreme measure, the introduction of the great mother goddess Cybele from her sacred home in Pessinus in Asia Minor to Rome. A sacred black stone representing the goddess was brought to the city with immense ceremony in the year 204 BC and installed with the promise that her presence would drive the enemy from Italian soil. The Romans did eventually win the war, but it took another 6 long, bloody years of unimaginable devastation, culminating in the Battle of Zama in far-off Africa. The Great Mother's promised immediate deliverance had utterly failed to materialize. Faced with this embarrassing discrepancy, the Roman priests did not admit error. Instead, they brilliantly reframed the narrative. They argued that the goddess's arrival had not been meant to provide an instant military victory, but to fundamentally change the spiritual condition of Rome itself, purifying the city and making it worthy of eventual victory. The prophecy's failure on a literal level was transformed into a spiritual success story, a testament to the city's piety in following the divine command, thus preserving the authority of the Sibylline books for future generations. This pattern of strategic reinterpretation was a common defense mechanism. The most famous oracles understood that their survival depended on their ambiguity, but when even that failed, they could resort to blaming the messenger or the questioner. A prophecy might be declared invalid if the sacrificial animal showed any slight imperfection beforehand, a flaw the priests might have conveniently overlooked until the prediction proved false. Alternatively, they might claim the supplicant had somehow polluted the sacred space with their presence, causing the god to offer a confused or misleading answer. In one documented case, a wealthy Athenian received a prophecy guaranteeing a successful trading voyage, only to see his ship sink in a storm. When he returned to the oracle in outrage, the priests calmly inquired if he had, by any chance, had a secret liaison with a temple servant before his consultation. Flustered, the man admitted he had. The priests declared the entire prophecy null and void. His impiety had corrupted the process from the start. The fault lay not with the god, but with the mortal's failure to adhere to the strict protocols of purity. This ability to shift blame onto the petitioner was a masterstroke, turning a moment of institutional failure into a reinforcement of its own sacred rules and the absolute necessity of perfect devotion. Perhaps the most audacious cover-ups occurred when an oracle's advice led directly to a military catastrophe. The priesthoods, often deeply networked with political elites, would engage in full-scale historical revisionism. Following a disastrous defeat, the official records and the stories told by survivors would be carefully managed to align with the original prophecy. If a general had been told he would win a great victory and instead suffered a crushing loss, pro-oracle factions within the city might spread the word that the general had, in fact, misinterpreted the god's words. The great victory might have been referring to a minor skirmish earlier in the campaign that was now elevated in importance, or it was a spiritual victory in remaining brave until the end. The names of the dead might be purged from certain public monuments to cloud the scale of the defeat, and poets paid by the temple would compose hymns praising the courage of those who had fulfilled the god's will by dying heroically. In this way, a clear predictive failure was laundered through the machinery of state propaganda and collective memory, emerging as a tragic but ultimately divinely sanctioned event. The oracle's authority was not just preserved, it was often strengthened as the narrative now emphasized the mysterious and unfathomable nature of the god's plans, which foolish mortals could never hope to fully understand. This complex dance of explanation and excuse reveals that the oracle's greatest power may not have been foretelling the future, but their unparalleled skill in controlling the story of the past. Yet, even as Alexander consolidated his hold on the known world, a deeper, more personal quest began to consume him, one that would draw him across one of the most lethal landscapes on Earth to the most isolated oracle in existence. After conquering Egypt and being crowned pharaoh in 331 BC, a title that inherently designated him a living god, Alexander's ambition evolved from mere military domination to a desire for something even more absolute, divine validation. The local Egyptian priests hailed him as the son of Ammon, but for a Greek king leading a Macedonian army, this was not enough. He needed a pronouncement from a sanctuary that his own culture venerated, and there was one oracle that stood above all others in its mystery and remoteness, the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis, lost deep within the vast emptiness of the Libyan desert. The journey itself was a calculated gamble that nearly cost him everything. In the brutal heat of early 331 BC, Alexander left the coast with a small contingent of close companions and guides striking out into the sands. The route was a notorious death trap, a 250-mile expanse of featureless dunes where the sirocco winds could erase all paths in hours and the sun could kill a man in a day. Ancient sources like Arrian and Quintus Curtius recount the dire turn events quickly took. A ferocious comes-in wind, a sandstorm of biblical proportions, blew in, swallowing the horizon and scattering the party. The guides allegedly became hopelessly disoriented, and the group ran out of water, facing a protracted and agonizing death by thirst and exposure under the blinding sun. Just as despair was setting in, the legend tells of a most unlikely salvation. Either a sudden, unexpected rain shower miraculously replenished their skins, or a pair of snakes appeared, slithering across the sand and leading the parched men to safety. To Alexander, these were not coincidences. They were unambiguous signs that the god himself was guiding his steps, clearing a path for his chosen son. This harrowing ordeal was not a setback. It was the necessary purification, the trial by fire and sand that proved his worthiness to receive the ultimate truth. When they finally staggered into the lush, startling green of the Siwa oasis, it must have seemed like a vision from another world. Towering date palms surrounded a sparkling spring, and at the center stood the temple of Zeus Ammon, a stunning fusion of Greek and Egyptian architecture. The oracle was administered by a hereditary line of priests who were famously independent, answering to no pharaoh or foreign power. Alexander, still caked in the dust of his near-fatal journey, was led into the temple's inner sanctum. What was said in that confidential meeting remains one of history's most tantalizing secrets. The high priest, according to tradition, greeted him not as a mortal king, but as Pi Dios, O son of Zeus. He then apparently confirmed in a private audience that Alexander was indeed the divine son of Zeus Ammon, and that his father's murder had been fully avenged. This was the endorsement Alexander had risked his life for. He emerged from the temple a transformed man, his very identity rewritten. The prophecy from Siwa became the cornerstone of his personal mythology and his most powerful political tool. He immediately sent word back to Greece and across his empire of the god's confirmation. For his Macedonian soldiers and Greek allies, this was a complex and troubling claim. In their tradition, a man could be favored by the gods, even descended from them generations back, but to claim direct, literal divinity in one's own lifetime was a shocking break with convention. Yet the sheer audacity of the claim, backed by the authority of the revered Siwa oracle and the undeniable fact of his unprecedented victories, made resistance futile. Coins were minted depicting him with the ram's horns of Zeus Ammon, a direct symbol of his divinity. From that moment forward, he began to demand the ceremonial prostration, or proskynesis, from his subjects, an act of reverence previously reserved for gods and Persian kings. This divine self-concept, fueled by the oracle's words, fundamentally altered the trajectory of his campaigns. He was no longer just a king expanding an empire. He was a god-king on a mission to unite the world, a living fusion of Greek and Eastern divinity whose authority was absolute and beyond question. The prophecy gave him the unshakable confidence to push further east than any Greek had ever dreamed, into India, convinced that his divine father willed his success. It also sowed the seeds of the paranoia and isolation that would later mark his reign. as he grew increasingly intolerant of any perceived disloyalty from men he now saw as his inferiors. The journey to Siwa and the words of its oracle were the crucible in which the legend of Alexander the god was forged, proving that a prophecy, once embraced, can not only guide a destiny but completely remake the man who receives it. But if the physical rituals were the body of the oracle, then the language used by its priests was the very soul, a meticulously crafted, esoteric vocabulary designed not for clarity, but for power, mystery, and above all, strategic ambiguity. This was not the ecstatic cry of the Pythia. This was the cool, calculated translation by the male priesthood, a process of encoding raw divine revelation into a specialized jargon that protected the institution's authority while offering a lifeline of plausible deniability. They spoke in a secret dialect of the divine, a lexicon where every word was a lock that could be opened with multiple keys, ensuring the oracle's survival through centuries of political upheaval and human fallibility. At the heart of this linguistic system were the hexameter verses themselves, a poetic form that by its very structure encouraged ambiguity. The need to fit ideas into a strict meter of long and short syllables often forced the use of unusual words, archaic synonyms, and complex phrasing that could bend in multiple directions. A simple concept like victory could be expressed through a dozen different metaphors: the crowning of spears, the favor of Ares, the unbroken line, each carrying slightly different connotations. This wasn't a flaw, it was the entire point. The priests were masters of this art, weaving the Pythia's fragmented utterances into verses that sounded profoundly authoritative yet were ingeniously vague. They employed a toolkit of deliberate obscurity, words with double meanings like pharmakon, which could mean both poison and cure, conditional clauses that hinged on unstated factors, and most famously, the use of potent multi-layered symbols. Consider the most famous Delphic pronouncement of all, the advice given to the Athenians about their wooden walls, saving them from the Persian invasion. The term wooden walls was a masterpiece of oracular jargon. To a traditionalist, it might suggest the literal wooden palisade surrounding the Acropolis. To an innovative military strategist like Themistocles, it pointed clearly to the city's fleet of wooden triremes. The priesthood did not specify, they provided the symbol and let the recipients argue over its meaning. This shifted the burden of interpretation, and thus the burden of failure, onto the shoulders of the supplicant. If the Athenians had chosen wrong and fortified the Acropolis, they would have been slaughtered, and the oracle's reputation would have remained untarnished. The god had spoken truly, but the mortals had failed to understand. By providing the correct interpretation, the Athenians validated the oracle's wisdom, but the system was designed to ensure the sanctuary could never be proven definitively wrong. This specialized language also created an exclusive hierarchy of understanding. The average farmer or soldier listening to a proclaimed prophecy would grasp its surface meaning, feeling the awe and mystery of the god's words. But the elite, the generals, the politicians, the sophisticated ambassadors were often privy to a deeper, more nuanced reading. They might consult with the priests afterward in a more informal setting, seeking clarification on the subtler points of the verse. This created an inner circle of those in the know, who understood the complexities of terms like anank, inescapable necessity, or kairos, the opportune moment. This exclusivity enhanced the priesthood's political influence, making them indispensable advisors to the powerful, the gatekeepers not just to the god but to the true meaning of his words. Ultimately, this secret language was the oracle's greatest defense mechanism. It was a semantic force field that allowed the institution to navigate the treacherous waters of human affairs. It could promise a king he would destroy a great empire without specifying which one. It could advise a colony to found a city where they see a white-haired native without guaranteeing the soil would be fertile. This linguistic flexibility allowed the oracles to be all things to all people, a steadfast rock of divine certainty in an uncertain world. and a cunningly adaptable political player that could always claim it had been right all along. Yet, even as the new faith of Christianity swept across the Roman world, dismantling temples and silencing the old gods with imperial decrees, the ancient hunger for divine guidance could not be so easily extinguished. While the great public oracles like Delphi and Dodona fell into ruin, their sacred springs sealed and their altars overturned, the practice of prophecy did not vanish. It simply retreated into the shadows, adapting and evolving in ways that would secretly shape the very religion that sought to destroy it. This is the story of the oracles that refused to die, the underground networks that kept the old ways alive, and the surprising fusion of pagan prophecy and Christian mysticism that emerged from the twilight of the ancient world. In the remote mountain villages and isolated country estates far from the watchful eyes of imperial authorities and zealous bishops, the old traditions found a way to persist. The public consultation of a Pythia was impossible, but the core of the oracular experience, the seeking of direct communication with the divine, could be repackaged. In these hidden spaces, the role of the seer was often taken up by wise women and local folk healers, figures who had always operated on the margins of society. Their methods were less grandiose but followed a familiar pattern. Instead of a tripod over a chasm, they might use a bowl of water or a pool of ink, scrying for visions under the moonlight. Instead of laurel leaves, they might burn local herbs like sage or bay, using the smoke to induce an altered state of consciousness. The questions they answered remained heartbreakingly human. Worries about love, health, and harvests, the timeless concerns that no imperial decree could ever abolish. This survival was not merely a matter of peasant superstition. It involved a fascinating, deliberate syncretism. Astute pagan priests and philosophers, seeing the direction the cultural winds were blowing, began a calculated project of translation. They rebranded their practices using the new language of the dominant faith. The supreme god of the philosophers, the nous or divine mind that was the source of all inspiration, was quietly equated with the Christian God. The daemons, the intermediate spirits that were believed to carry the divine will to the oracles, were cautiously reinterpreted as angels or saints. A prophecy from a local nymph shrine might be attributed to an appearance of the archangel Michael, who was often associated with healing springs. This strategic rebranding allowed the essence of the practice to continue under a new, acceptable name, creating a thin but effective veneer of orthodoxy over deeply pagan traditions. Perhaps the most significant and lasting fusion occurred within the realm of dream incubation, the very practice made famous by the healing sanctuaries of Asclepius. Early Christian monks, particularly in the deserts of Egypt and Syria, recognized the power of this ritual. They established monasteries that became new centers for divine healing, but the process would have felt deeply familiar to an ancient Greek. A sick pilgrim would travel to a monastery dedicated to a healing saint like Saint Cosmas and Saint Damian, often built directly on the site of a former Asclepian. They would undergo purification through prayer and fasting, then spend the night sleeping in the church or a special side chapel, exactly like the Abbaton of old. They prayed not for a vision of Asclepius, but for the intercession of the saint, believing that the saint would appear in their dream to heal them or prescribe a cure. The testimonials from these Christian incubation sites, preserved in religious texts, are nearly identical to those from the pagan era. We read of a man with a paralyzed hand dreaming that the saint surgically removed a worm from his finger and waking up cured. A woman with a growth on her breast dreamt of the saints applying a salve and found the tumor gone in the morning. The mechanisms of faith, suggestion, and the placebo effect were identical, only the names of the divine healers had changed. The monks who interpreted these dreams were the direct heirs of the Asclepiad priests, using their knowledge of herbs and human psychology to translate the symbolic dream imagery into practical medical treatments, all within the safe and sanctioned framework of the Christian faith. This underground survival and strategic adaptation ensured that the spirit of the oracle did not perish with the temples. Instead, it seeped into the foundations of medieval culture. The concept of seeking a prophetic vision through ascetic practice and isolation became a cornerstone of Christian mysticism. The Delphic command to know thyself was internalized by monastic traditions as a journey of spiritual introspection. Even the famed ambiguity of the oracles found a new home in the interpretation of biblical prophecy and apocalyptic texts, where priests and scholars debated the hidden meanings of Scripture with the same intensity that their ancestors had once debated the riddles of the Pythia. The voice from the tripod was silenced, but its echo continued to resonate in the prayers of pilgrims, the visions of saints, and the enduring human belief that the divine, in whatever form we recognize it, still speaks to those who know how to listen. For centuries, the incredible stories from places like Delphi were dismissed by scholars as pure superstition or clever priestly fraud. How could a woman's ravings shape the fate of nations? How could a cave's vapors truly connect mortals to the divine? It seemed the stuff of legend, until modern science decided to investigate, turning its tools on these ancient mysteries and uncovering a stunning reality where geology, chemistry, and psychology converged to create experiences that felt utterly supernatural. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source: geology. In the late 1990s, a team led by archaeologist John Hale and geologist Dodona began re-examining the very ground beneath the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Ancient sources consistently mentioned a sweet-smelling vapor, a pneuma, that rose from a fissure in the rock inside the sacred chamber, the Dodona, and intoxicated the Pythia. For decades, historians had dismissed these accounts as myths, arguing that no such gas could exist there. But Dodona, an expert in the region's fault lines, made a crucial connection. He found that Delphi sat directly atop the intersection of two major geological faults, the Delphic and the Colonies, which crisscrossed right under the temple ruins. Such fault intersections are known to be pathways for subsurface gases and water. The team then analyzed the rocks and water springs in the area, and their findings were nothing short of revolutionary. They discovered that the limestone bedrock was rich in bituminous deposits, and the faults provided a conduit for methane and ethane gases to rise to the surface. More significantly, they found evidence that the ancient spring water, which was also used in the rituals, contained ethylene. This was the eureka moment. Ethylene is a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon gas, and it is a potent psychoactive agent. In the 1920s and 30s, it was actually used as an anesthetic in surgeries. At low doses, it induces a trance-like state, a detached euphoria, and can cause vivid hallucinations. Crucially, its effects include violent physical spasms and an altered voice, precisely the symptoms described in ancient accounts of the Pythia's possession. The geological evidence suggests that the fissure did indeed emit a gentle, intoxicating flow of ethylene gas, which would have pooled in the enclosed, low-lying Dodona where the Pythia sat on her tripod. She wasn't faking her convulsions or her raspy, altered voice. She was experiencing the very real physiological effects of a mild, gaseous anesthetic. The priests, observing this over generations, had perfected the ritual around a genuine geological phenomenon, creating the perfect conditions for what appeared to be a divine encounter. Yet gas alone does not explain the staggering accuracy and enduring influence of the oracles. This is where the sophisticated psychology employed by the priests comes into play. These were not mere mystics, they were masterful practitioners of what we would now recognize as cold reading, profiling, and information management. Before a petitioner even reached the Pythia, they would undergo a lengthy and elaborate process. They would be required to make a costly sacrifice, the quality of which was meticulously examined by the priests for omens. This wait time was crucial. It allowed temple attendants to engage the visitor in conversation, subtly extracting details about their home city, their personal troubles, or the political situation that had brought them there. A state delegation from Sparta asking about war would have been very different from an Athenian merchant inquiring about a trade voyage. By the time the question was formally posed, the priests often had a wealth of contextual information. This intelligence network was Delphi's true secret weapon. As the most prestigious pilgrimage site in the Mediterranean, it was a hub for information. Travelers, diplomats, and merchants from every corner of the known world passed through, bringing with them news of crop failures, political unrest, military buildups, and royal successions. The priests synthesized this constant flow of data, building an unparalleled real-time understanding of the ancient world's geopolitical landscape. When the Pythia, in her ethylene-induced trance, uttered fragmented phrases, the priests were not just translating her words into hexameter verse, they were interpreting them through the lens of this vast intelligence. Their resulting prophecies were therefore not wild guesses, but brilliantly informed strategic analyses wrapped in the unassailable authority of the divine. The famous ambiguity of the responses was a deliberate and genius risk management strategy. A prophecy that a king would destroy a great empire was factually correct whether he won or lost his war. This system protected the oracle's reputation, allowing it to guide the course of history not through magic, but through the masterful application of information, psychology, and theater, proving that the most powerful magic is often a deep understanding of the human mind. But even as the echoes of Alexander's footsteps faded and the Roman Empire itself began its long transformation, the oracles endured, their voices growing fainter but never fully silenced, until one final, chilling pronouncement marked the true end of an era. The year was 393 AD. The Roman Emperor Theodosius I, a devout Christian, had already issued his earth-shattering decrees banning all pagan rituals and ordering the closure of the ancient temples. For decades, the old faith had been in retreat, but the great sanctuary at Delphi, though its coffers were emptier and its pilgrims fewer, had stubbornly continued its sacred work. Then came the order. Imperial troops were dispatched to Greece with a clear mission to seal the temples for good. As the soldiers marched up the sacred way, their footsteps a grim counter-rhythm to centuries of hopeful pilgrims, they were met not by armed resistance but by a profound and eerie silence. The priests, knowing the end was upon them, prepared for one final, desperate consultation. The last Pythia in history, a woman whose name is lost to us, took her place upon the tripod one final time. There were no grand questions of state, no kings seeking favor for war. The air in the Adyton was still. The sacred vapors from the earth, if they rose at all, were weak. What transpired in that chamber was described years later by the Christian historian Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi in his youth and heard the account from those who were there. The military commander, perhaps curious, perhaps mocking, demanded that the oracle deliver one last prophecy. The Pythia, in a voice filled with a grief that transcended her own, delivered a final hexameter verse. She did not speak of victory or defeat. She did not curse the emperor or his soldiers. Instead, she uttered a line of heartbreaking resignation and profound symbolic power. She said, "Tell the king the Ferot Hall has fallen to the ground. No longer has Phobos his hut, nor his prophetic bay, nor his talking spring. The water is quenched. The soldiers, likely baffled by the poetic lament, merely carried out their orders. They extinguished the sacred hearth that had burned for over 1,000 years. They sealed the cleft in the rock, perhaps with concrete, silencing the geological breath that had intoxicated generations of priestesses. They removed the tripod and the other sacred objects, and the great bronze urn that had once held the water from the sacred Cassotes spring was taken away. The temple was closed, its doors locked, and the voice of Apollo at Delphi was extinguished forever. The Pythia's words were not a prediction, they were an obituary. She was narrating her own death and the death of her world in real time. "The water is quenched" was a literal description of the spring being sealed, but it was also a magnificent metaphor for the end of divine inspiration itself. The wellspring of prophecy, which had flowed so richly for centuries, was now dry. Her prophecy, however, held a second, even more stunning layer that would only be understood much later. The phrase, "the Ferot Hall has fallen to the ground," was not just about the physical temple. It was a direct, verbatim quote from a much older poem about the death of the hero Patroclus in Homer's Iliad. In that context, the line describes the metaphorical fall of a great warrior. By choosing these specific words, the last Pythia was connecting the end of her era to the very founding myth of Greek culture. She was saying that the world of the Homeric heroes, the world that had given birth to the gods and the values they represented, was now finally truly over. Her final act was not one of possession, but of profound scholarship and heartbreaking poetry, a final, brilliant act of interpretation that linked the closing of the temple to the deepest roots of the civilization it had guided for so long. She didn't just deliver a lament, she composed the perfect epitaph for the entire ancient world, using its own most cherished text to sing its funeral dirge. In that moment, she ceased to be merely a vessel and became the author of the end, ensuring that the last words from the oracle were not a cry of defiance, but a solemn, dignified, and eternal farewell. And so, these 30 untold stories pull back the final veil, revealing the oracles not as simple mouthpieces of the gods, but as the ancient world's most sophisticated and complex institutions. A breathtaking fusion of raw spirituality, cutting-edge science, deft political maneuvering, and profound psychological insight. They were all at once sacred banks and intelligence hubs, psychological clinics and diplomatic clearinghouses, theaters of divine ecstasy and laboratories of early medicine. The voice that echoed from the tripod or rustled through the oak leaves was never just one thing. It was a chorus blending the ethereal with the intensely practical, the divinely inspired with the brilliantly human. Their true legacy is not a collection of accurate predictions, but the very bedrock of Western thought they helped to form. From the philosophical concepts of Heraclitus and Pythagoras to the tragic dramas of Sophocles, from the earliest principles of public health to the complex mechanisms of international finance, the influence of the oracles is woven into the fabric of our history. They taught us to look for patterns in chaos, to seek meaning in ambiguity, and to understand that the future is not a fixed destination, but a landscape shaped by our interpretations, our choices, and our own humanity. They stand as a timeless testament to our enduring need to confront the unknown, not with certainty, but with courage, curiosity, and the unwavering belief that even in the deepest darkness, we can find a sign to guide us. Now we turn to you. Which of these hidden histories reshaped your understanding the most? Was it the chilling, literal fulfillment of the prophecy at Didyma, the psychological ingenuity behind the terrifying oracle of Trophonius, or perhaps the profound story of the enslaved woman who became the voice of a god? Share the story that captivated you most in the comments below. We're truly curious to hear which mysteries resonated